You're cool. So, I mean, we could do that. It should be very seminar style, very interactive. Don't interrupt at any time. We should have conversations. I think it's the easiest way. I mean, I have an enormous amount of stuff I could potentially show, and it should maybe be guided a bit by where you want to drill into. And I think we can, in 3 days, we can get quite deep and quite far, but not the whole story. So you've been discussing yesterday. Did you all see the event?
Yeah, we all did.
Was there any kind of leftover to be discussed? Any kind of worries or challenges? Or?
The way around it.
Huh?
Get the other way around it, discussing that project a little more. We're curious to see your stance on say, what you want to teach.
Sure. But I'm asking you whether there was anything you would have wanted to ask. It's always useful. We had a discussion, we had a panel discussion. There was a lot of things flying around. You were witnessing this, so there might have been afterthoughts or reflections, and that's what I'd like to hear from you guys. If there were, or if you just kind of silently absorbed it and say, I have to think about that.
I'll share a reflection.
Yeah.
So my background is really in the classical world, Greco-Roman world, and looking at urbanism and architecture through that paradigm. And I was just thinking about, as we were talking about the panopticon as a system of kind of social relations and spatial relation of order, the emergence of cities around rock formations in terms of acropolises and creating that kind of high ground, and then actually instituting temples on top of that high ground, and then having monuments to gods who are actually made with eyes which are somewhat lifelike. I think it's quite an interesting aspect. And then looking at the way in which at the perimeter of the polis, the city walls would be erected to distinguish the boundary between the polis and the surrounding agricultural hinterland. It's something that just struck me in contrast to later urban formation of like Miletus, the grid formation, which was then spread to Naples, Neapolis as a later kind of export. Seeing that original spatial formation emerge around the geography, but also specifically the way in which the gods were privileged, in which they exert a kind of proto-panopticon type of architecture within the natural terrain is something that struck me as a resonance.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you mention gods and religious phenomena in relationship to that. It's what comes to mind is that they're both human universals. I mean, in terms of or human society universals, some kind of architectural manifestation, but also some religious, and they're related this way with the architecture is a physical embodiment of societal relations, kind of stabilizing. You need a material substrate to cling on to, hold on to, and that can actually accrue and grow. It's always there, while the generations. But what is also and that's a universal condition. I mean, there is no human society without that, and couldn't have been. That's my claim. But there's also no society without a religious element, except since modernity. And but I like Durkheim's formula. I mean, I could write the formula. I had the formula in my lecture. I said something like architecture equals society, or something like this. And you can also say religion equals society. But he was saying rather God symbolizes society, or what you hold sacred in religious rites and reverence is the dependency on society, and that's rational to do. So also sacrifices and reverence, when you gather, you reverence the dependency on the community and the society, and that ties in with the religion also holding up codes which are society sustaining, and the sacredness of these just indicates the importance and inviolability of those, because without that society collapses. Anyway, it's an interesting one to discuss, to see that these religious sites are also universal. What I thought what is interesting for me when I present these things, and I had yesterday a slightly different take where I emphasized the physicality also of and the initial impulse of protection, which is very immediate. That struck me as important. Of course, later on, that you can hook onto this unintended ordering potentials, which isn't something you can have intending to do as an immediate achievement, but it's something which is set off an evolution where later on, because so that initial intuition, when you say reflect the deepest purpose of architecture, shelter, that is this initial initiation moment, but then what is really the profound contribution, because is the ability of these structures to start ordering social relations which grow beyond the kind of roaming flock of primates. Yeah.
I have an interesting example based on that history. I'm not sure if you know the history of the city of Bucharest, which actually is quite interesting because it kind of passes through all of these evolutionary phases. It was this kind of muddy land connecting the Western world and the Eastern world, and then it was a passageway, and of course all of these, all let's say, the low scums of society would gather there, trying to pillage the convoys moving in and out from the Western or Oriental world. And then at one point they found this kind of drier land, and they built this kind of watchtower. So it was the first form of imposing some kind of protection, which was outside of the architectural realm in that sense that they would build a shelter, but it was this kind of guard tower.
Okay.
Around it, it started to emerge this kind of what it's called the poor man's, let's say, some kind of bit of will, maybe medieval bit of will, in which people started to in that sense, profit from the protection of the tower. They try to exploit this kind of pity of trespassers. And then, based on that, the next kernel that actually developed around was, of course, the religious part, so church. And by this kind of combination of structure, let's say spiritual guidance, which is also structure, different kind of structure.
Sure.
A very interesting element was created in Bucharest. I spent my master thesis analyzing Bucharest as a complex system and proving that there are two types of spaces which are, let's say, particular to or pertaining to a complex system in Bucharest. One is the mahala, which is like a Turkish name, this kind of clustering of around the kernel. But we have a lot of mahalas in Bucharest which kind of organically developed. So there is no, let's say, Roman order that will come in the commands. Those are organic evolution. But then you also have this kind of empty spaces which are called Maidan, also a Turkish name, spaces of, let's say, entropic export, I would call them, in which the entropy generated by these kind of clustering elements had to be exported somehow, otherwise the system would have collapsed. And it's still the case for I made a case that Bucharest still exists as a city because it still kept this kind of, so it kept the mahala structure within this kind of religious, let's say almost totalitarian, if you want, supervision, surveillance system of the tower, which is still there, still exists. And then, but also, as a counterpart, it also kept the Maidan as a kind of no man's land, freedom where things can happen politically, socially, economically, from all reasons. I think it's a really interesting, let's say, study case, from my perspective, definitely it was, to prove that a modern city, big metropolis, okay, not big to the scale of Shanghai, but still interestingly big, about 4 million inhabitants, can develop from this kind of completely organic agglutination of not so organic entities. So the cells themselves, the mahala, were kind of structured in a way. However, their evolution and the way that they scattered was completely organic. So, and Bucharest is kind of a resistant city to any kind of modernist. Even Ceausescu's totalitarian intervention was kind of, let's say, the the response of the city was some kind of necrotic tissue, so it tried to somehow cover this kind of top-down approaches. However, it at a cell level, it didn't. So whenever you're trying to approach the organism itself, it was responsive aggressive if you want. But if you're working at a cellular level, or this kind of nucleus structure, then no. So it's a kind of, I think it's an interesting take on having both sides of and this discussion about how this structure of space and lack of space structure can actually work together to actually sustain a city. Which, again, from my perspective, if Bucharest gets built, all of those Maidans get built, it will suffocate in a matter of probably years. It's already doing that.
I mean, but even these kind of loose agglomerations, they establish structure, even if it's not preconceived. And that dialectic, I mean, the whole city evolution in the medieval towns, they were not unplanned mostly. And then in the late medieval period, of particularly the Italian city-states, when they became conscious that in the period of Renaissance, we started to actually draw up what had evolved and idealize it into an ideal city. This kind of concentric structure. It's nearly an inevitable natural outcome of an agglomeration process. And it's interesting that in Nicosia, for instance, where you kind of strap the ideal city boundary onto an evolved organic cluster. Anyway, okay. Thanks for these contributions. So, I mean, just a few points, maybe as a preface. For me, architecture theories, the whole point of it is to lead practice, guide practice, obviously. So it's very conscious. It's not a kind of its own thing. It needs to empower us to know what we're doing and to guide the whole discipline going forward. Because there's lots of controversy, choices, options, directions, and so architectural theory on that level of a comprehensive, reflective endeavor to summarize the contribution of the built environment and the discipline of architecture within that, its evolution relative to an overall societal evolution. And for that is highly pragmatically oriented, and you can see if you pick up my books, that it's in volume 2, as a series of proposals of research agendas and also offering a lot of conclusions as theses, how we should understand the societal conditions, how architecture is contributing this, has been contributing, and should be contributing going forward. So that becomes a program of action to some extent. Also going quite far into individual values, architectural values and aesthetic values. So that's the purpose of architectural theory. And it needs to be embedded in social theory, I believe. It has a series of, that's as the primary embedding. Of course, when you in the practice of architecture as an interdisciplinary, not the architecture, building and construction and city building is an interdisciplinary. You have also other disciplines coming, engineering disciplines, and so, of course. So there's all the sciences are involved there. They are based on physics, but architecture and its role in this one is, as I always say, is in the ordering of social processes, that ordering capacity. And then, therefore, with that phrase, we in social theory as a primary context, theoretical context. Now, to the extent that social theory, including architectural theory, is a very complex topic, we will at a certain point of depth of reflection will encounter puzzles, and we also, as big theory builders, which I invite you to become, we have to confront philosophical puzzles and questions like every ambitious scientist would. So that's the way philosophy feeds in, as clarifying the project. We have to be. It's for me important to say that, because they become only very temporarily become a hobby horse and an interest, but we need to never forget what it feeds into. An overall action program. It's a bit like time wasters, and that's why the key reference for me for the relationship between practice and theory is Marx and Lenin, for instance, or later on, let's say Rothbard or Mises or these kind of characters. Just this is the spirit in which I work, and so we have to. You can't make that a very short demand immediately, always with the pistol on the chest. Tell me now where this leads. But you have to have it as a horizon. And I've reached there. I think, that's the claim, I've developed a full and comprehensive theory of architecture which has a lot of guidance capacity, reason and argue, that I know where the development of architecture would feed into progressive project of pushing the civilization forward. And I know, and I can be constantly critical of a lot of detractors who are in the way, or let's say who are misguiding, misleading, but also placing everybody and nobody is totally useless. There's always aspects, but a lot of partial projects which don't fully understand the overall trajectory, identify and seeing their value, and trying to push and probe and draw them in, and so that's what I'm trying to offer. But the fundamental pragmatism is critical to grasp, and to somehow to have that ambition when you kind of fascinate an idea and you want to follow. And you say, and why are you fascinated? Where would that help you? And some of you have projects, and the same as, let's say, if you have an artistic project of an interactive installation. I mean, it's great. We've been into responsive environments for a long time. Wouldn't it be great if the built environment was self-modulating and responsive to follow our purposes and adapt itself to an overall life process enhancement, and so it becomes a pragmatic, real project and not an art project. Art is that space where you can experiment, where you don't have to deliver yet. But of course, particularly if an architect goes into an art domain, you use that space not to get lost there, and because the art world inherently has no purpose. It's the whole point of it, to be a chamber of exploration, which then other disciplines can pick up an instrument. So that would be, for instance, interesting to remember. And I'm particularly interested in this responsive environments. At the moment, they exist still only in an art context mostly. Can they be put into a real life process? And of course, there are a few things. At night you walk close to your house and the light goes on. So that's a responsiveness, and it's great. You don't have to kind of fumble to find but there's of course much more that could happen. So that's a pragmatic thrust of this, but also one which is working on issues which are in the central arenas of central importance to push the civilization forward. So that's why, for instance, I look at in the knowledge society, the major high productivity clusters, urban clusters, firms like Google within that, how do they function? Because they're the great prosperity engines and those who push our material freedoms to the next level. what kind of environments do they need? Maybe they need interactive environments. And so you understand how they operate, why they operate like this. How could I, what degrees of self-organization, freedom, structure do they need to find that balance? So it's just the spirit of this whole theory. And even going and understanding that the historical development is there's this kind of relevance criterion of everything we talk and think about in terms of gearing ourselves up for making an impact.
You mentioned the notion of order.
Yeah.
Architecture brings order.
Yeah.
Are you referring to the architecture to the order from the perspective of complex system, where order is let's say, going as far as possible from the equilibrium state and getting more complex and more say, advanced? Or you were talking about the same kind of philosophical order of things in which architecture is kind of guiding the path of humanity in a more metaphorical way? Is it structure?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, it's such a base category that is very difficult to. You can the definition wouldn't tell you much. So it's examples of what we mean, and when we say it's also a relative project. If you look at the development of a project, and the question is which additions and design move would increase order, but at the same time complex order and complexity. They have a whole chapter and they're trying to define what is complex variegated order and what. So it's it's difficult. I don't want to venture to define it. There's lots of examples of this, and it's something. The claim here is that a complex order, and it's important to link these two terms, is a more robust and high performance, more productive structure. You have lots. There's not many more capacities which emerge as an entity establishes layers of organization and intricacy of feedback and so on. So it's the difference between a worm and a tiger. There's a huge, it doesn't mean that the worm isn't ordered. So, but it's a complex order. There's this hierarchy and layers, and then you build up capacities and intricacies and so on. And in human societal conditions, it's rules of interaction, but also differentiation. So the key, if you said, where's evolution going? Evolution, one thing it delivers, inherently through the selection process, it sifts out and it advances creatures with higher capacities. How in thousands and millions of ways you find unpredictable. But one thing which has been noticed is higher levels of differentiation and organization are usually the outcome. This is also the same with societies from the primitive flocks, which could kind of emerge nearly spontaneously if you throw a bunch of outcasts onto an island. They will emerge some kind of cooperative structure, or in a way kind of. But then there's other much more elaborate social structures. We need time, and they have. So that would be kind of attempted an answer. The same as with so size is an element of a larger order and more complex order if you have more elements to be integrated. But then you need to differentiate, hierarchize, more rules. The alternative for order is just simply randomness, which doesn't add up to anything. A series of random events or a garbage heap is not functioning. Is not. So order means also that aspects and elements whether it's a set of buildings or sort of human bodies, add up to something more. This is kind of idea of emergence and the idea of being more than the sum, more than the parts, as a just separate and not integrating into new capacities. Well, both. I mean, let's say it's interesting that if you use evolutionary algorithms and so on, there's these kind of fitness criteria which apply to an individual character. But when you're talking about order, but each, you rarely find a kind of the higher capacity usually has parts and an organized whole which has some kind of underlying order. In terms of the order of the city, I now believe that it's that I believe in bottom-up spontaneous orders or evolved orders with a lot of moving and free parts, which could, through a trial and error process and a sifting process, can find each other and configure into an organization which adds up to new capacities. And what I also find is obviously this multifunctionality of where the different elements within an organized whole have multiple roles, and that also the whole with the multiple wholes superimposed. So we come to this as we have to learn. There's some of the complexity theory, discourse, cybernetics, they were working on these issues on an abstract level. Anyway, let me dive into this a little bit. This is actually quite an old presentation, but so for me this is also a cumulative system building. I mean, this is for over 20 years. That is one thing I could talk about the built environment and so on, but now talking about architecture. And because I'm talking in the context of architectural theory, this just picks up the intuition that whether you would that somehow a kind of bicycle shed or your grandmother's back extension isn't belonging to architecture. Why? Because it's not part of it. It doesn't enter the discourse of architecture. So what I'm talking about here, architecture, you could say it with capital A or something which it is a discipline for us, and it's an academic discipline, but it is a discourse, and then not all structures are referred to and participate, and not all designs which are offered up into a discourse. Okay, and I come to this because I'm saying something like it's architecture if it is part of a discourse or have potential to be part of a discourse and this profession / discourse and discursive practice has by necessity or has evolved, and it's an important demarcation of it against other practice, a theoretical strand. Okay, so architecture is always theory-led design.
How would you distinguish between, how would you define architecture? What would the difference? Where would be the line between mainstream and all architecture?
Mainstream, now this is an older text. I would now say, let's say vernacular. Maybe I should substitute this. Let's say if there is no these buildings, vernaculars or even modern vernaculars or some kind of trivial mainstream because it has no, it doesn't participate in the discourse of architecture. It's not theory-led. It's not innovation. It's another for me. So for this an academic discipline. So I want to raise the bar of architects. It's not just the kind of worker who does routine, trivial, repetitive things. That becomes nearly like, look, and historically I'm making the distinction between tradition-bound building, where you just do what you've always done, and architecture, with Alberti, is a conscious, self-reflective, theory-led, innovative contribution. Not just, but if you, in this ambition of innovating means you have to actually argue for. That's why theory becomes a necessity. Because if you do what has always been done, there's no questions asked. You're just fulfilling what's expected. You don't need theory for this. You're just routine. You're nearly like a robot, or like unthinking, doing your duty and what is expected when that house is built like it's always been built. One more. That's not architecture. And you also see that, and tradition-bound building was originally self-building, and you did what was always been done, and then it became construction troops. And the interesting thing is the separation of design out of construction. Because if you focus on construction, you already know what you want to build. You're not thinking what to build. It's taken for granted. And if anything, it was clients who were guiding this. It was the abbé or the bishop or the prince himself, who was the educated person who had to set what to be done, and then it was usually just rebuilding what was already established. And it's tradition-bound building. So, and architecture is very, very different. It's discourse-led. So then it comes full on. It's amazing. It comes in full flesh with a full treatise. And we don't know anybody well, there's Brunelleschi and there's a few others. We only know the Renaissance architects. All other periods don't have architects. And we can recognize in Alberti and Palladio our colleagues in direct lineage, whereas we have no clue about who was involved in the Cathedral of Cologne. And there's no author, there's no reference, there's nobody like us who thinks like us. We're thinking like Alberti, it's all there, and you can read it in volume 2, I've gone through. And it is embedding an ambition of a new innovative architecture for the good society, which is reflected, or it comes right away with the reflection on the good society, on the proper, the embedding in social theory, also the polis, how to lay out a city, talking about the political institution and the parts of society and how you lay it out. It's very, and what form it takes. You find all this in Alberti. And the house, the household, and the social structures, and then the innovation in that. And then the whole theory of how to do that well and best. And it starts there and goes on with the treatises through Serlio and Alberti and Palladio and Blondel and on and on and on. That's architecture.
Just a question, can we consider then that the Versailles Palace was actually designed by the Rassolais instead of any kind of architect, because he was the guy theorizing his vision, his social vision, structuring by the means of architecture. So is the Rassolais, is it an architect in that sense?
Maybe. I mean, what's interesting is that, for sure, one thing is that so there was a strong differentiation against construction and crafts. And it comes to theory and drawing. before things, there was nothing fully drawn. They were just drawing straight onto the ground, staking it out and raising the arches. They had sketches for fragments, and then the thing was anyway evolving. So the full sort of drawing. Now, of course, Alberti was a man of letters. He was a theorist of painting. He wrote treatises. So it's typical that his was only one of his roles, but one of his roles was something we now recognize as an architect. I mean, there might be other disciplines which recognize Alberti as their lineage, and the same is with let's say it's called art. Let's get it. Painting and sculpture were part of this equally. So all the architects were also painters and sculptors. Michelangelo, Raphael, they were all architects. Bernini, they were sculptors. And they're also proto-scientists and engineering. This wasn't differentiated fully. That comes later, how that differentiates out. The important thing is that differentiate out, it's a discursive discipline. And we can, and it's a discourse where the books, Alberti had many books, but this book leads to Serlio, leads to Palladio, and actually crystallizes out quickly. Because Palladio was much more of an architectural only figure. But you still have so Christopher Wren being still a scientist and so on, and even in Schinkel you still have a painter. But later on they become more crystallized. Sir John Soane, they all have their treatises, and they all have their. So yeah, maybe this guy's an architect. It's not crystallized, particularly against art, sculpture, and painting. It comes together because painting and sculpture at that time anyway wasn't a separate thing which appears in a Saatchi gallery. It was constructing real life environments for real life purposes. So what we now call art didn't exist at all. It was the same. It was the design disciplines, right? To construct the frame of everyday life, and that was sculpture and painting were involved in that. And they're now maybe painting. The inheritance of what painting was is now graphic design. No, I think it's very important that they could have never done without the books, without that reflective medium. There's also, I mean, that Derrida found also, for instance, and discourse literally, that's now talking about books, needs writing. Because in an oral discourse, and I can only talk like I'm talking because I've written these books and 150 articles, and you've read, that's why we have a conversation. This conversation in a purely oral culture is absolutely out of the question. In an oral culture, you talk anything more than trivialities, takes a form of, you need actually rhyme, rhythm, poetic structure to memorize something which has a length which across several pages. But that's it. You don't go beyond that. So writing, also drawing, how far can you go without a full system of, but at the same time so it can't be just in a building. You can draw it back out potentially, but no, you can't reconstruct it. It has its own the discourse, which I'm talking about, which is written discourse, and of course with printing it became much more potent and with these network effects of participation, but it already existed without printing. I mean, Alberti's book was printed like 20 years after he was written. It was circulated as a manuscript. So you had some form of discourse before printing, but discourse of printing, and just mushroomed. But it's not only architecture. It's modernity is in all the phenomena of social life suddenly made that switch from a kind of tradition-bound way of thinking, highly evolved in ritualistic, repetitive, superstitious things. They all became conscious, reflective through discourses. So you have at the same time, for instance, the same idea, and it picks up on early achievement in Greek culture. At the high point of Greek culture, you actually had something like architecture, and you had political theory. Then it all disappeared, nearly, and was very, very thin. And then you re-emerges in the modernity when you have Machiavelli, Hobbes. So you evolve Montesquieu. You have a kind of discourse on the social institutions, which lead to the founding of America and the Constitution. So you have these great literatures. Science starts to develop. You have disciplines like professions like physics and engineering. They're literature-based and discourse-based and book-based, and then they become academic institutions. And so many phenomena of the contemporary life that starts at that point, and you have the differentiation also of these discourses. And of course, at the beginning, there's these literary figures. They're in several of these. You have also the reflection on language, and you have grammarians, and so I think that's very important. And we couldn't have the modern civilization without this.
Actually, kind of basic question, but it's an interesting one. I mean, how do you define theory? I mean, it sounds like a really big question, but I think what I find so problematic is that actually, I mean, there's a book came out recently, I can't remember, it wasn't the author, but said there is no theory of theory. And that's all we have, basically, is a series of kind of recipes, like a cookbook. And that's in some sense, and I've often struggled to think what it is, because I think there are different manifestations of theory. I kind of influenced by the kind of critical theory pattern. But it's quite tricky knowing what that is. And in some ways, actually, Claudio's point is kind of an interesting one. Do you see it in the architecture? I mean, in some sense, if you see the kind of process of critical reflection,
that's it,
that generates an outcome, and after all, you're distinguishing between architecture and building. Therefore, it has to be manifested in a final aesthetic object in some senses. That would seem to imply that the theory is embedded or at least it lies behind.
Yeah, it lies behind it. You couldn't have the same object without the theory. It impacts, and that's the whole point. The better object, the sophisticated object, which has taken care of more concerns, has more capacities. Now, you can have these kind of objects if you have 1,000 years to evolve them. Now, what theory does, it's an accelerator. And there's also mistakes you could make, and maybe but it's a huge accelerator in the discourse, in a sense, simulating evolutionary process, because you look at that and you anticipate, if we do this, then this is the effect. So you don't have to do it and let the effect work out and let these societies with the wrong decision perish. So instead of 1,000 years, it takes 20 years or 50 years or 100 years instead of 10,000 years. But it's still some of later on, you can see. So it's a huge evolutionary accelerator. And of course, it's in the object, because without science as discourse, where you have theories and simulations basically in texts, and now you couldn't have a product which does that, nor could you have an aircraft. But I'm also saying you couldn't have a sophisticated building like the Bauhaus, 1927, as a social communication machine without architecture theory.
But then how do you do that? From our perspective of Mayan temple, actually has all of these features. It has a technological aspect. They're looking for the science of the time, the alignments, shadow, and all of that. It has a purpose which is higher than just building it, because it has a place on the deity, it has this kind of social status. So basically, it has everything but the writing part. And I'm not talking about that they're
I don't know about their writing. I don't know them, but so I'm ignorant. But I suspect that there must be something similar, or it just took far, far longer to get there.
They found it to encode information. That's my thesis. It says that you can encode visual information. You have to have the writing part.
Maybe this is then, if it's not through writing and simulating, then it must have taken much longer to get there. It's an interesting challenge. Interesting challenge.
There was, a comment made by Delander at the Digital Tectonics conference, and he said, with Cecil Bowman there and a bunch of other engineers, he said, I felt like I'm being surrounded by these material philosophers. So in some ways, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because if you see an engineer as being a material philosopher, which makes sense to me, Then you've got maybe a carpenter who's kind of working with materials but not quite so philosophical about it. It's a kind of gradient in some sort of ways, and I guess there are forms of intelligence that go into the production of a building that are not necessarily explicitly theoretical in that kind of like form of writing, but nonetheless forms of knowledge that are
sure.
informing.
But look, something like the Centre Pompidou. I mean, look, there's the easy one to understand is all the engineering which goes into it, and of course there is engineering, science, discourse, writings, papers, calculations, but also scientific papers which lead to this. And you couldn't have some building like Centre Pompidou with the huge kind of scientific research papers. So that's theory. Now the architectural part is more vague, but still it starts with Alberti and has the whole idea of modern architecture starts in the early 19th century in the German discourse about form and function, the analogy with biology and the part and whole relationships and functionality. So leading via Semper and Villers de Duc into Muthesius, Otto Wagner, modern architecture, that leads to the Centre Pompidou. This is also a little, it's less, so there is, and yes, that, and I'm focusing on this high performance, sophisticated artifact. Even an artwork has discourse and art theory, but it's less important. You could have somebody coming totally intuitive and creating a kind of disruptive piece, which without being led to by a discourse, but the piece isn't performing anything. It has no capacities. And then to arrive in the art world, it needs critics to see something in it. But artworks are not good examples, except when you're talking about something which the general public will also understand as a beautiful achievement, a Caravaggio painting, which compels everybody, like a shock of superiority at that period, the treatment of light and depth and verisimilitude of character and so on. That was an achievement which needed theory in terms of an art theory through Alberti, the perspective and the construction of perspective, books on perspective, but there's only other aspects maybe they discovered, but I don't know enough about this. But I'm saying if there was something super sophisticated, I can guarantee you that there's literatures leading into it.
So what would you actually say that architecture is not architecture if there's no critique of itself?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
If there's no entity complex enough to be able to criticize.
I'm raising the bar. We're in a civilization which has architecture, which means we're demanded, and of course there are people just rolling along and living off and only half understanding and imitating. But there's somebody who hadn't imitated this, who was kind of original, and that comes out of this theory-led.
Based on this, Greek architecture was definitely architecture following all of your
Greek, yeah, Greek, yeah. Greek. Yeah, but when you say, let's say, I call the Gothic as a transitional, because these are quite sophisticated, but the Romanesque is for me is just a bastardized, bad imitation, vernacular, it's a kind of vernacular, degraded Roman. So it's not architecture for me, and even the Gothic, because it's a bit of a provocation, but I think it's a fully fledged architecture because it lacks the ingredients of conscious innovation, authorship embedded in literatures and so on.
Structure innovation,
of course, and I don't know enough about it, so that's why I don't castigate the Gothic. I castigate the Romanesque and say architecture full on and fully fleshed, and we are in total lineage with the Renaissance architects. And then there's the tradition is the late medieval period. Political consciousness only starts with Machiavelli and Hobbes. Of course, it was then Aristotle, but what I don't know about in between. It's a whole research project. If you wanted to see, but I don't. You just make a cut and say that here I know architecture has arrived, and then it was transition. Or you can say politics has arrived, meaning with political theory and thinking about political constitution, which is an accelerator. All prior political institutions, they took thousands of years to evolve, and they didn't have discourse. They had kind of superstitious, ritualized reinforcements of religion. That's not discourse. It's nothing to do with what I'm talking about here. So but then once you have political discourse, you kind of super accelerate, and you have the United States of America as a product of the Locke's and Montesquieu's and so on. Yeah. Anyway, is there any windows we can open? Is there fresh air? Because these things don't bring fresh air. Can somebody look? No, it is not fresh. There's no duct into this. This is just circulating inside there. Can you open the window? They all locked? There must be something.
It'll be very humid to see it.
No, just at the back. Yeah.
I think that's going to be very hot.
No, I know, but I need oxygen. How can you think without it? Because these are just rotating. They're just coolers. Just open one window. They're just coolers. Is it open? Yeah, that's a bit, because otherwise we're still organisms. The supercomputer needs kind of clogs up otherwise. Okay.
Actually, just a moment.
Yeah.
It's probably worthwhile just having a sense of when you want to take breaks on this thing. We had what Akin was doing was to have a break in the middle for about half an hour, and to have maybe a break in the middle of each session.
Yeah, we should have 2 breaks at least.
Yeah. So
We do 3 times 2 hours.
we don't have to do 3 times 2 hours.
I can do it quickly. Yeah. That's why sometimes when I do these kind of sessions, a single lecture could take 9 hours because every slide we can discuss.
But just to clarify, the EGS model is 6 hours. This one is actually 4.5, so you can relax it.
Right. Oh, okay. Of course, yeah. Only 4. Okay, we can make still 2 breaks. Nice. So this was what I hinted earlier. But we have to understand not confuse ourselves with art and not with engineering, by the way. This separation becomes later. In a sense, painting and sculpture was in there. Like now I'm saying, all the design disciplines are in there. So, but what we now call art is something very different. Architecture has very little to do with that. Yeah.
Are you referring to any specific definition of art?
Yeah.
Definition of art?
Yeah. So my definition, what I think contemporary art is a experimentation chamber or brainstorming chamber. It's a space set aside in society, and that evolved. I mean, that just happened. Why? Because painting was left when photography came in, and the graphic print media. There was a lot of artists left idle and dangling. So and that was a chance to use this resource to evolve a new societal organ which didn't exist at all before, which is what then became the art world. And what's good about the art world is it's a space of where you can try out anything. It doesn't have to work. It's just stimulating, provoking, making you think, seeing an opportunity. It's a kind of proto-design, proto-invention, proto-something. It's raw. It's a bit like And that's why I call it the brainstorming chamber. And if you look at, and that this was incredibly productive, one demonstration is actually with the design disciplines and architecture. If you think about modern architecture, the work of Le Corbusier, Bauhaus, Rietveld, Gropius, the whole modern Mies van der Rohe, you can see quite quickly and demonstrate how much it depended on abstract painting and abstract sculpture. So modern abstract art, which is at that point fully evolved into something which has no purpose, which existed as a discursive realm, generated the resources for architecture and design. And so that's the way I see it. But a similar example would be, let's say, video art. Any art. Actually, there was internet art at the early stages. It was incredibly important because with a new medium, you want to find what you do with it, interaction, how do you, telecommunication. So there was internet art trying to mock up protocols. Now we don't need it so much because we have Facebook and Snapchat and Wikipedia, and they were the proto Facebooks and Wikipedias. So that's the role of art. So it ties in, but also so that's why architecture and all the creative disciplines use the art world. That's why you temporarily do something in there. Well, Mark Fons is using them, but in the art world, and that's very, very important. I'm saying architecture as a discourse, a profession which is different from engineering discourse. They have their own discourses, which are separate largely. Art has its own discourse. If you go in there, the way your work is discussed, looked at what's good about it, is very, very different. So it is a different discourse practice, and it has separated out, even if you use it, and there are inside there the professional artists, the only artists, they are the kind of Damien Hirsts, and then there are the Mark Fonses in here who discursively here and they use it, we are in there and using it, you might be in there and using it, and then there is kind of, for instance, filmmakers are using it. But video art, for instance, is not something which has any use in everyday life. There's only one group is using video art and consuming video art and potential to video art, which is professional filmmakers, documentary makers, who are looking out for new effects. Nobody else is sitting down and watching you. These are unwatchable because they're not functioning. Whereas documentary, you need to continuously watch them to educate and know about the world. Movies, we continuously need them to self-reflect our role personally and ambitions and construct our life project. So I make the difference. Like the difference between movies and video art is also the difference between architecture, for instance, and certain space installations of a Sol Levitt, etc., which they don't function. And that's why they also kind of separate in this kind of heterotopia of the artwork. They only go for occasionally for this kind of, or they exist. So that's very important to realize the relationship. But of course, there's a lineage out of this. It's different from painting of the 17th century. That's working in everyday life. That's creating the ambience for the palace, and the ancestry is displayed, or the town hall. You put the councillors in that mood of historical achievement and their role and importance. It's as important as to make that a large room and put it on axis and so on. So they all work together. So that's like. Graphic art, decoration, whatever. I make the distinction between these kind of creative industry disciplines, and art is the one which isn't participating in everyday life. It doesn't matter that a wealthy person is putting that coons into their storage or into their kind of third villa they have somewhere. That's not the coons. That's kind of a misuse to some extent. But it's funding that discourse practice, which is a functional. Anyway, so.
It was Mark von Essen, that thing. Did you say he was an architect?
No, he's an architect, but he's using the art world because he's using all his projects are funded by the art world, so they have to have a double life. They exist there. They sit in the Pompidou. He's at Art Basel. Our stuff as well. We have to do our furniture research. We use the art halo and the art world where they don't care about what we care about. Where they're just looking at the fetish object, which because there's an artiste, a provocation. And then, of course, there's something which ties in. Innovation and newness and novelty needs to be part of it in the art world. In absolute, the only thing which counts there. And the overlap is that in the creative industry disciplines, novelty is never enough. But of course, innovation needs something new. So there's the overlap. In the art world, it's only novelty and spectacle and strangeness and provocation. And in the but we need that element of novelty and anyway. So we can dip into it, but we have to understand the point here is that the discourses are very, very different, and the role these objects the object might be in two, have a double life, but the actual object which exists in the art world actually doesn't function fully. That's why it's there. And therefore, the mistake you're making, if we're talking about a fully functional building and say this is art, we're confusing things. We're bringing the wrong criteria to something here. These criteria are only about future potential. Now, there's one aspect where I would say deviate slightly, where in some buildings have this kind of manifesto character, where they still also provoke and inspire and point beyond themselves, but maybe already embedded in the discourse, which has not kind of fetishistic and false criteria, fetishistic and false for the actual purposes. Anyway, so you can read that up. It's all in volume 1, the distinction. But we also have to, and that's the big one, challenge, never confuse architecture with science or with the engineering disciplines, which are, and of course they were also evolved together. This crystallizes quite late. So the architecture separates from the art when art becomes something else, but also then the kind of graphic design specialization emerges. This one is also crystallizing in the 20th century more and more. In the 19th century, all architects were engineers as well. And all the treatises of the great architectural treatises have these chapters in there on construction and the engineering technology. It's very strong in Alberti, it's very strong in Palladio. You still have it in Schinkel, you have it in Sohn, but it becomes less and less. And when we read architecture theory, we always skip over these bits. And this is cast aside when modern architecture comes around. It's fully cast aside. You don't in Otto Wagner's Modern Architecture of 1899. There's no more than this chapter on construction. That's separated out. But it took a bit longer when I still learned engineering beyond what I should have learned to interface. I'm saying engineering and architecture work closely together, and we need to be congenial, know of each other, or we should know them. But I'm not responsible. I need to calculate. I still have to learn how to calculate I-beam sections and so on. It's like, but you can't, but so this has separated out, And now we don't do the slightest technical work very responsible. We're only doing the surfaces. I mean, we help coordinating and so on, dimensional coordination. But I think it's interesting that when in the, let's say in the 80s still, there was no facade engineering. So while structural engineering, mechanical engineering was already fully, we were still engineering our facades. And you have the innovation of a Foster developing these curtain walls, maybe with Arab and so on, with engineers as well. But it wasn't a specialism. And then there was this kind of, we focused on the detailing of this, and it was still more, and it was, of course, in architecture, it was always suffused with the aesthetic project, worrying about the appearances, the character, the ordering of this. And now we fully shed the responsibility of this. Now we don't even, internal secondary surfaces are engineered by professional engineers, where every hanger and every bolt is calculated. Nothing is left to the architect. We're not allowed to touch anything which is technical, right? Now, and so that doesn't mean that we have to have most close collaboration, but we need to be clear about the separation of competencies. Now, it creates a vacuum for a lot of architects because the only thing that they see as rational and able to talk about is the technical aspects. And they're mute when it comes to the aspect they're actually responsible for, because they don't read the theory and they're kind of, and it's vague and difficult and it's more complex and hard to grasp. It's the ephemeral and so on. So that's why that's kind of puzzling for and troubling for architects. If you listen to a Foster lecture, that's because I respect Foster as a great innovator of the firm, and he's embedded in a discourse where Rogers has much more theoretical knowledge, and he's embedded with people with Rainer Banham. They're embedded in discourse. You don't have to be, not everybody has to be a theorist, right? So a Foster, talking about his project, he's only talking engineering. Which he's not responsible for.
However, how do we integrate this kind of what I would call structural intuition in projects as an architect? So you have, as a designer, you have to have this kind of, let's say, decency of structure.
Of course.
So
you need to, you have to not, they need to, either they continue to feed you and cross out, but if you don't know anything, it takes too long. You have to develop your intuitions and but then it's also sitting there every week to guide you, and after a while of you learn, but you're not. But anyway, so I have written these articles. What our role is, even like when we bring in these new technologies, new materials, we are the ones who want to work with them. We're the proto-engineers. We push, and we have like the Achim Knippers relationship. Is a kind of Achim, and we as architects should be interested not only that these are the lightest, the stimulation of new forms which are possible, of new effects of translucency, the black and white carbon fiber and the see-through and the morphologies, the rigor of these morphologies. That's what we are interested in intuitively, and we're a bit shamefaced to talk about it. But the Knippers cannot talk about this because it's professionally on thin ice. He can never talk about this in an engineering paper. So he has to withdraw only the technical aspect. For him only counts in all these structures that they're the lightest and they're robust, they're flexible, they're durable. That's his discourse. And Achim, in the end, doesn't. He should care because it makes it possible. It's not durable. They won't have, but we are interested in another. So there's a division of labor which is quite rigid, where we have to talk about the expressive potentials, the morphological ordering potentials. Of course, we also talk technical, but I think we do that only in a preliminary way. We do it as dilettantes. And that's my challenge to the pragmatism group is this. That's why I said, pragmatism 2.0. Yes, we did this. We do the proto-engineering. We are into the manufacturing and fabrication. We push this on, but we're not going to deliver that. It's time to hand this over we've kind of kick-started this. Let's hand it over to engineers more and more until the next wave that we have to find. I mean, that's my attitude, but I think it's so with the new materials and new fabrication technologies, we're going back a little bit into this because the engineers aren't doing it naturally because they're following us. So that's part of the avant-garde role. But in the end, in the full-fledged, and now user-frame mainstream, I said before, it's not architecture. I've changed my mind about it. That's why it's a very old lecture. There is something like mainstream architecture, the kind of sophisticated rollout where all of this is going to be taken over by engineers. And the architect is the one who is working for the client about the ordering and also expressive articulation of these orders, relations, and purposes. That's our task. That's you later see the semiological project becomes central. But anyway, so we need to understand that be conscious of this distinction and what's left for us when all of this is gone. Then I say the ordering of social processes. And I say the ordering and then articulation of social processes. Articulation means making transparent to users. It's not good in just ordering this, and then people come to it and can't use that because they don't know what's connects, and they're not empowered to use it because it remains opaque to them. So that's why we need articulation, ordering, and that feeds back and makes the order more elegant, quicker, and a better social process. So you can make an architectural order which doesn't become a social order if it lacks articulation. Because we have socialized sentient users who need to perceive and understand the complex environment to make use of it fully. Yeah.
There's a school of thought that thinks that Hakim's not an architect, he's more an engineer. What would you say to that?
I disagree with it because he's not a good engineer. But he's a good architect. The question is, should we become more articulate about it? I respect him as one of the best. For me, the dilemma I have is that the greatest protagonist of contemporary architecture are figures who, and he has a lot of theory, methodology theory, analogies he likes, the morphogenesis analysis, the material computation. And that's also part of theory, by the way. We come to this later, all the elements of architectural theory, reflecting on the medium, reflecting on the methodology, all leading to the final product. He's lacking a little bit inviting them to pick up more what they will be confronted with inevitably when they do larger projects is that aspect of communicating the complexity they're building into, and also seeing if you do a little pavilion, it doesn't come through that these new repertoires of parametricism are all about not only about a much more differentiated and complexly differentiated overall social process they articulate in a larger structure. It doesn't come through in a pavilion because it doesn't have a purpose yet. It's a research piece. And so these pavilions are contributions to architectural discourse because we query them with respect to architectural criteria and engineering as well. So they're not art objects because they're not sitting. Once a collector puts them somewhere and makes a story and pushes Achim as the great artist, then it's different. Then they have a double life. But they are fully embedded in our discourse. But they're not the real Makai yet in terms of then they would be redeemed. And I have the vision of Google Campus, where a lot of this for auto research comes in. I mean, look at Google Campus and the DRL field research starts to feed into Bjarke's and Heatherwick's Google Campus, but at the same time far behind. It could benefit so much. We should all be invited. Achim should be invited to work with a number of people, including myself, to make that the super prosperity engine for Google, which now has far too much monotony, which isn't differentiating, isn't intricate, doesn't articulate the various parts. You step into Google Campus, you mostly don't grasp the underlying order and differentiation and potentials. So I think we should do that. I would go there with these guys in tow as a team to create that. By themselves, they haven't read enough of autopersuasive architecture to self-instrumentalize sufficiently. So I think, for me, Achim is a great architect, but they're partial innovators and progressors, very, very partial. Same like Eisenman, who's a great lead contributor, but highly partial, and he couldn't deliver major work. So there's lots of partial theoretical projects, but we need to synthesize them in some kind of what's the state of the art, drawing together these researches, partial researches and reflections, including theorists, into a most sophisticated contribution of the discipline to society. Where would that come out? I say it's a Google campus in Manhattan or something. Just going through this, what they discussed. This is another thing, this kind of novel. So, innovation is key. You can't have innovation without theory. And intuitively recognizes that the innovators are the great architects. So it means also this. And most of them have been writers. I mean, Rem Koolhaas we consider one of the greatest innovators, the proliferous writer, Le Corbusier, the one who wrote the treatise, but also Mies wrote, Gropius wrote. But not Hannes Meyer, but not necessarily everybody. The innovators of postmodernism, Venturi. But then you have people like Graves who couldn't write more than 3 sentences. That's possible. So you have Venturi, the great theorist, Colin Rowe, College City, is not the designer. You have these clusters which have architect theorists, great innovators, only architects who intuitively are drawn in and put under the guidance, and the selection from, and then the theorist. This is a constellation. So if you have the deconstructivism, you have the great intuitive geniuses like Zaha and Frank Gehry, who not theorists, but they're embedded, they're continuously talking at schools, taught to, in discourses, they're embedded in discourse, they're not writing and originating discourse, and then have their own ideas within that, but they need the Tschumi and Eisenman and Rem, and Libeskind is a kind of the oddball who wants to be a theorist but can't. And becomes a kind of poet, which is also sometimes poetic kind of writing helps as well. So that's the constellation. Plus you have the Mark Wigleys and Andrew Benjamins and Neil Leaches, and then you have an architectural movement and making history. And if you look back at the history of architecture, we only care about the original contributions. It's not about masterpiece, it's about the original, innovative, where there's a breakthrough. That's all what counts. And you can see here that these discourses have an incredible forward drive. The big headline is innovation, progress, the human project pushing forward. And that's what it is. Same as sciences. What you learn in school when you're in a science class isn't science. That's textbook teaching, that's pedagogy. Science happens in the innovative scientific papers, the new researches, the new breakthroughs. That's what the history of science is contained. That's science. That's why it's always science. But of course, you could still call it science. It's kind of in application of let's say we call it avant-garde science, mainstream science, still called science. But we should. I see myself, and everybody sitting here is in that avant-garde condition, at the frontier. But we have to also realize that we want this to be matter and really be the breakthroughs which percolate through and in the end shift the whole society forward. So we need the mainstream design, the avant-garde science also needs a dissemination that on every engineer's desk, through the textbook, this insight is appearing everywhere. And the same should ours. So now it's called mainstream, still architecture, but I'm saying avant-garde versus mainstream. And the vernacular is different, which has, I expect of the mainstream now, because every building in the world, in an advanced country at least, is designed like every product is designed by somebody who's been to an engineering school and or has an engineer involved. So the engineering science is included everywhere. To some extent, every single building which is designed by an architect who went to an architecture school. So in theory, at least, ideally, they know the great protagonists, they've learned the lessons. The architectural discourse, what we are saying, is disseminated to should impact every single building. They should all know, they all know Gary and Zara and Schumi. How much they understand is another question, but intuitively they quickly grasp that they can do now superposition to make this work. They're allowed to do these angles and to solve the problem. They should all know parametricism. They know every single building. I don't know. There's still vernaculars and pseudo vernaculars. But I've been lecturing around the world in various cities of India, and everybody knows. So every single building in the advanced world knows me, knows what I'm talking about, knows parametricism as an option on the table to help. So that's included in architecture. Well, it isn't any architecture if the architect, the educated participant in a discourse, and even it's only secondary, where he's learned something at school and reads an article online. That's versus a building where the architect is kind of slapped around and the owner himself says, no, I want to look like a flower, like lotus. That's not architecture. That's kind of vernacular or the breakdown of architecture. Because it has no credibility, it's not part of the discourse. Whereas the guy who's trying to do a kind of something even if he's oriented, our discipline is fragmented, he's trying to do a Chipperfield, and he's seen that and he's learned that and heard about minimalism, that's architecture, I respect it. But where the client comes in, this should look like a dragon, that's not architecture. Because that's I've never seen in an architecture school this being uttered, or if it was uttered, it was thrashed in a split second, and the student would have never dared to say this again. So so there is a filtering capacity, all to the last remotes of anything built. But the same thing goes for design objects. So I'm saying what is beautiful about this, that this discourse, and I'm including the design disciplines because we're also into product, we know Ross Lovegrove, we know Dieter Rahm, and we know fashion designers. So, and everything here was done by a colleague. This is the designer. I mean, I don't know about this chair was done by a colleague who knows Eames. Everything you touch here, the building, this projector, everything, this shirt. So you have to see the design discipline as a totality has total and exclusive competency with respect to the totality of the human phenomenal world. And this now includes also, since it includes landscape design and urban design and public design, it's literally everything you ever touch. Is gone through this needle's eye of our discourse, where all these things connect. Because a landscape designer can become super famous and inspiring for us. I respect, fashion designer like, what's this girl? That's why we are not ashamed. We're designing shoes and fashion design to design more suits. When you see, in the end, it's all communication and articulation and semiology as well. Anyway, and Iris, but of course they are specialized a little. They're slightly separated. But my view is that there's a stronger connection, in a sense, discursively between ourselves and Iris van Herpen, or between a Yohji Yamamoto and the Chipperfield, minimalism. You can put a label on it, and there's continuities, that Daniel Wedrick was my student, works for her, etc. There's inspiration, and I call this actually still a unified discourse of the design discipline, and discursively, they're fully commensurable, the same categories of relations of form, function, aesthetic values at play, where it's about the touch and feel, and also this guy, what's his name? The designer. Johnny Ives.
Yeah.
Of course, he's our friend, and Ross is the biggest body, and Ross is my biggest body, and the guts inside and the technique, we don't know anybody and knows nothing to do with the scientific paper. So the discourses, even though we work with structural engineers, discursively we are far closer to all the design disciplines and all the engineers. And the engineers, they migrate between all this. You have, engineering is engineering. The engineer doesn't care if he calculates the stresses in this phone case or the or of a tower. I mean, there's also subspecialization there. But I think the big distinction is architecture versus engineering, and then there's various subdisciplines which sometimes match up like this. And I now have to put this real in brackets. It's our thing. That's true, but I now include mainstream architecture is real architecture because it's still touched by this discourse. If it refuses to be touched by the discourse, either because a client wants it to look like a dragon, or because the architect is so ignorant and thinks he can be himself creative, but doing something which just doesn't connect up. Something that is kind of naive thing where you told a student, is sometimes very dangerous in a student, oh, you should have your own, out of your own creativity, you should do something. If somebody does that at a building somewhere in the province, and he gets away with it, it's not architecture. It's some kind of abomination, which has nothing to do with architecture. It's like kind of, as if you would say, some kind of hobby home painter who's doing flowers and then showing the local gallery or is doing, putting them on, or doing, we call these things kitsch. They have no credibility, no existence in the art world. Now, some of these distinctions in China are not fully resolved because you have, in the art schools, there is crafts and kitsch is hand in hand with, I don't want to be arrogant, but but therefore also this idea that it's architecture, if you do something you kind of creatively do, I'm sorry, it's not. It has no credibility. If it doesn't filter through the disciplinary discourse, it doesn't have a footing in the discourse, it must be an abomination. Because we reached at a sophisticated level where things fit into a sophisticated culture. You could also behave properly only if you've been socialized into this. You can kind of come cold, like a kind of random move fitting into sophistication. It can't be. Kitschism, of course. Kitschism is because it's kind of discursively reflected, ironically discursively reflected. Now, I even say this: the vernacular of this world is not architecture, but as soon as an architect, and let's say somebody like Rudolfsky, says architecture without architects, there's a kind of paradox there. He can bring it in because now we look at this and it gets inspired. And we're saying, we're doing biomimicry, or biomimetics, and we do vernacular mimetics, we learn it. So they become elements of the discourse. The author isn't part of it, but the product is now in a discursive space and investigated discursively and inspires. So it becomes, through Rudolfsky's famous book, Architecture without Architects, whatever is showing there is now architecture in a strange way. As it contributes to the discourse. Not in its life out there. But so that's why kitschism isn't kitsch.
Yeah. We were wondering yesterday if it was you know about if the project yesterday was a kitschism project, or it was like.
Well, okay. David, Stephen Ma stuff. The houses, I'm not sure. A lot of in the museum is, I don't know if it's kitschism. This stuff. The problem is that Stephen Ma, because it's different, the enterprise of a 3D printing. And that's the dilemma a lot of people have who set up startup companies. Same with some of my students. That economics, it's not a discourse, it drives them wherever they are making money in 3D printing. So this thing is just a 3D printing job, and there's nothing, this castle has nothing to do with architecture. And he doesn't even design it. That's not architecture at all. But I don't think it's kitschism. This castle is not kitschism. Maybe some of his other stuff is kitschism if you had that sophisticated loop, and it is within. We're looking at it and we accept it, and it's a kind of Hanan kind of. We came on with this kind of kitschism and so on. I respect that. I accept that to some extent, and maybe that feeds back into. Well, as I said, but the discursive element is important. In these guys like. Who are working very intuitively. I was a bit, let's say, surprised. I mean, and it's interesting. You could be quite sophisticated and yet don't get that the overall fitting into the civilizatory project, like Roland Snooks. Of course, there's several. We will come to this. All the different components of architectural theory, methodological theory, so on. We need to bring in the new computational methodologies at the beginning. There, we're just playing with them to find. But then we instrumentalize them more and more. Some of this ornamentation could also be instrumentalized in terms of decoration, comes semiology. He doesn't have these categories, so he's just playing with it and knowing what's good for. He's totally relying on just, oh, it's fascinating. Oh, I can do that. It's a kind of spectacle. It's risky. I mean, he's relying, I think, this group by itself, there's a risk of this, and parametrism, that's why I came out with parametrism 2.0, if it becomes this kind of self-loved and we're all doing only these kind of art pieces and so on, and real architecture goes somewhere else, if we don't muscle it in, it becomes a kind of abortive, left out, marginalized, ineffective thing which is later clipped off the history of architecture. It's a bit like Pleshnik in 1930. Pleshnik's Ljubljana and the library stuff and so on is nice, but architecture was somewhere very different. You put that next to Sharon, I mean, you know where the history is made. And Pleshnik became a marginalized, obscure, left-out figure. And Frank Lloyd Wright could have done this, but he came back with a vengeance with something like the Guggenheim. Interestingly, later on, Pleshnik was rediscovered by the postmodernists as a proto. So that's a bit like the Rudolfsky bringing back the vernacular, but Pleshnik and those who didn't catch on, let's say all the expressionists and Art Nouveau's characters who didn't make it into the modern movement, whatever they did post-1920 is cast aside until it is picked up. But maybe it wouldn't have, maybe it wasn't it could have maybe not picked up, and then it would have been totally lost to the discourse and history of architecture. Well, it needs to be picked up, needs to be redeemed by later stages, and that's this kind of a pre-adaptive advance. What some of the stuff is.
Who are the adapters? Who are those agents that they
Yeah, other architects who have real jobs to do and use it and instrumentalize it, and also, but also having a critical understanding and guiding to convince others. In the end, you need to convince larger groups. I think there needs to be a convergence. If it becomes very, very small, it's risky that this kind of, the train of architecture is going somewhere else. I don't think it's happening, by the way. I think we're winning this race. We are going to, and this will be the big train of architecture. But
one of the first problems of Competencies 1.0 was the toolism.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a
tools
necessary stage. It's a necessary stage. It's like you know, exactly. But 20 years later, and of course it picked up lots of things, and to integrate structural, and so the engineering discipline was a necessary step. To worry about fabrication was a necessary step for this to mature. It could have been done by engineers, not necessarily by architects. But to explain the advantages and necessity nearly of that new level of complexity, intricacy, and ordered legibility, of maintaining legibility in the face of complexity, of this parametricism, that needs to become transparent and needs to become compelling, and we need to convince each other to then take over clients and lead everybody through this. That's very, very important. And that can't be, toolism is not, the fascination with a new tool. Of course, tool for what? Not that you just build this or something. This something has to be high performance, has to be necessarily superior. I mean, this is so compelling. And all the tools which are involved in AI and so on are fully redeemed. I mean, we know why we need this. We don't know yet why we need this kind of swarm algorithms, which Snook is doing. I know why, but the world doesn't know why. And Snooks isn't helping explaining why they need it. It's just doing it. It's a can-do, toolism, and can-do thing. You know, and I think these things will be redeemed on an urban level. On a lot of, it's also interesting. Kukuja and these swarm algorithms are fantastic on the urban level. Can also be there could be multiple levels could be used. That's where the real potency would be. But also, if you have intricate and varied ornamentation, and anyway, these are computational techniques. I like also the way these kind of the 3D printed, concrete reinforced, reticulated panels. There's potential in their lightness, structure, adaptability, topology of these lines could be topology optimized. It could be. I mean, there's a lot of things which of this could feed into an overall project, and that's yet to happen. I have confidence in this, but it's not on the and they might get through it. As he said, I will ask myself this question when I'm asked. Maybe he's getting through this. He's saying, I'm scaling up bit by bit. Somebody asked him something. I forgot. He said, "What would that mean for building and so on?" Or, I don't know. I will confront myself with this question if I'm getting commission where I pose this question. I mean, you can hope that you. It is another way, but I think to anticipate that. Look, not everybody can do everything. It's very important but they need to fit into an overall. Whatever we're delivering it collectively. But I think in this case, there needs to be discursive leadership to some extent. And he would say avant-garde architecture. And not all architecture. So I respect architecture. That's the difference. This is an old lecture. Which is kind of understanding the contemporary and making a good version. It could be original in the particular adapting. And let's say a piece of contemporary parametrism needs actually the creativity. In the modernism, you could just do them. Because it has this element of adaptation, adaptive fitting, variation. It's not going to be the same, but it doesn't have a kind of monumental originality. Just be a good, sophisticated version. So it means today it shouldn't be blobism, but tectonism. And it should be mature, recognizing, instrumentalizing the repertoire. That's for me a sophisticated piece of architecture, even though it's there's not much originality in it. But on the frontier, avant-garde architecture, that's true. I need to overemphasize this because we're moving away from, this was on a period where we were still in this strong avant-garde move, far away from mainstream rollout. I've reached this point now where I want mainstream rollout, and I want to talk that up as an exciting career agenda. And you get less in a mature research paradigm like ours, research, but also now already execute with great examples in a rollout phase. It's a bit like the 20s were the avant-garde phase, 20s and 30s in architecture, and the 50s, 60s were the big rollout phase. They still were in it. Innovation continues. It's not, but there was a lot of rollout application of the achievements and discoveries of the 20s and 30s were happening in the 50s and 60s. There was still, innovation is always continuing. And that's what I also said, the avant-garde is a permanent condition. This one is very important. So because of the, you need the theory because you're doing something radically new. And it also compensates, in a sense I said earlier, for the evolutionary sifting. It's a kind of discursive sifting. Evolutionary, of course, could happen. You can try it, build it, fail it, this one's better, and you don't have to speak about it. In the end, you have, but I think this could have never evolved, or it would have taken 1 million of years of thinking. So maybe something is also outside that reach. It's not only compensating for evolution and accelerating, but it's also reaching somewhere else altogether.
Do you believe that innovation can come from within? In terms of architectural innovation, do you think it comes from within, or it actually always reaches outside of the field to look for?
Okay, it's a very good question. So there's a lot of internal, and there's also a lot of, we need to prompt and stir engineers, and if they have new tools like finite element analysis and topology optimization, grab it in, because we need that congeniality, but also but then we have our own agenda with this. Because what I love about topology optimization is I take for granted that it is optimal and better, so I have to use it. But also what there's a congeniality, what fascinated me, that the force flow and the variation, even the answer, would be much more clear. And therefore, I would be clearer where, and if I put a big opening and push the supports apart, it shows up, and I will be able to read the pattern and say, hey, the entrance is here, or there must be a big void there, or something. So it has inference capacity, which I'm interested in as an articulator. So I love this, and you can also see how that fits the aesthetics of parametricism. Topology that shows if topology optimization, which emerged into architecture, maybe it's longer, let's say in the early 2000s, fits the aesthetic of parametricism, which predates this. You see how beautifully well kind of prescient and historically pertinent the aesthetics of parametricism is, if it is ready to receive all the innovations which are coming through. Always already recognized as beautiful. So we have the right sensibilities. We can recognize even future beauties because we understand the civilization where it's going. So that topology optimization, which an engineer can only care about that it is a more efficient. So you get the same load transfers with less material. That's all he can ever care about in a research paper. That this fits our aesthetics is a huge confirmation for our aesthetics. And that Chipperfield must find it ugly unless he's changing his aesthetics, means how bankrupt his sensibilities are. because he must reject the super high performance structures and insist on the high performance structures of the 1920s. So that is for me the kiss of death argument already.
But then we're talking about aesthetics, and we're talking about
Yeah.
you're mentioning parametricism as the inherent aesthetic value.
Yeah.
In a way. Isn't aesthetic something that we attribute to something which is not inherently there? But in the world of beauty is just
No,
something-
exactly. Of course.
So-
What aesthetic judgment is,
Yeah.
it's a intuitive, emotional, positive response to the high performance, and an intuitive, we're conditioned through the aesthetic sensibility to like the good and hate the bad. What's good for us and
But
don't
it's
like.
also contextual, like you said.
Yeah, it's always contextual historic. We have to relearn it. We need aesthetic revolutions. So we couldn't, if you're locked with minimalist aesthetic sensibilities, which I had, so I had to work very hard on myself to shed this. I'm still a sucker for this stuff, right? But I can consciously override this and start to love. So we need to, they need to be updated because the high performance morphologies look different now. The topology optimized organic kind of reticulated skeleton is very different looking from the mass fabricated I-beam grid, which was the best the 1920s had to offer in terms of technical high performance. We need to shift our sensibility in line with this new.
Instead of the building that you're, for example, building, act as hyper-excited in the city, because beauty as
Yeah,
it
yeah,
goes
yeah,
and some kind of aesthetic erotic
Yeah.
is a hyper
Yeah.
excited. So that means
Look.
that this excited. So it's actually every time we found honey as hunters-gatherers, we were excited by the caloric
Yeah, yeah.
potential.
Yeah, exactly.
We find the
Yeah,
luxury
exactly.
exciting because it enhances
Exactly.
the sexual.
Well, it's also the smell of something, all the sensible, so the aesthetic sensibilities comes in with the appeal repel.
Yeah, I agree. It's not.
But the thing is, we need to get attracted to the right things. As architects, when we work on our drawings and continuously cast aside the ugly and look for the beautiful, this should mean something. If we do this, we should be guided towards the high performance. It's not fail-safe. But the users themselves, the users have to start rejecting the Chipperfield building.
Yeah, but that's a problem.
Because the social process in there will be less sophisticated, dynamic, open, what they should want to participate in is less likely to happen there. Of course, if you put Google in there, they make it do, but but Google should also have an intuition to self-select, and they did. Bjarke Engels and Heatherfig was something very parametricism-like. They had the right intuitions. And actually, their previous campus, they went for the deconstructivist design of the former Silicon Graphics. It's deconstructivism, which was a better version of architecture than the minimalist boxes. The current campus at Palo Alto is deconstructivist, and now they're going for parametricism. This for me is a huge confirmation. And somehow in confirmation of their kind of intuitive grasp of what might work for them. They kind of imagine themselves into these when they see these renderings.
Always the context triggered this kind of hyper-excitement, which were not kept always. So, okay, we still strive for hypercaloric, but we are living actually in a hypercaloric world now. So, in the sense, how do you think your architecture, which is now a super exciter, aesthetically speaking, and for other reasons, how do you see it evolve in time? How do you see it? Are you okay with your buildings being demolished in 20 years' time, not in 100 years' time, because they're no longer, let's say, serving the popular perspective on what a hyper-exciting architecture aesthetically and functionally is? Would you be okay with that, or you want perhaps kind of landmarky, evolutionary, fossil trace?
Well, they should be updated. They should be, look, if we have a radical shift in civilizational logic, then parametricism is dead and should all be bulldozed down, and something new will emerge.
But can you incorporate this kind of change factor?
Yeah, you can. I mean, look, and there's within big epochal styles, there's also progress there. So the older versions will be less appealing than the newer versions. And in the overall texture of the fabric, you shouldn't be hyper excited by every single building. So there's also a merit in a more important institutional central to have more sex appeal. You know, and you not get excited by every ordinary.
So the problem is that the time frame shrinks every time, so we are against.
That seems to be the truth. I don't know when the next thing is on the horizon. I'm set for the rest of my career to push pragmatism. Most probably will last for another few decades. I mean, you haven't even started to implement it on a sufficiently large scale. There's no pragmatism district like they managed in postmodernism. Even though postmodernism was relatively short-lived, it was easily absorbed, and you have some kind of POMO districts. For instance, some segments of Berlin through also artificial means like the IBA. But you also have this thing in one of the cities of Spain, Boufil curated this kind of postmodernist. Where's it? Montpellier. Montpellier is a kind of postmodernist thing. You know, we don't have that yet. Even we have great buildings, Saudi architects created, but they are kind of isolated. We have airports. I mean, look, we have a lot. I mean, we have, and not only us. There's also corporate firms like we have the new Mumbai airport by SOM. Or Fuxas Shenzhen airport. I mean, these are major pieces of.
Yourself, would you call the major, let's say, figures now in pushing whatever purpose?
Well, look, my main protagonists are the tectonism protagonists, Achim and Mark Fons and Philip Yuan and all the people I've collected in my Pragmatism 2.0 thing, and there are of course others like I'm looking at more the let's say the avant-garde thrust is my interest. I still want to be there, although I'm rollout interested. So I respect, of course, Benjamin Berkeley in the studio, who are on the rollout condition. Firms like Lava, who are in between. There's many I respect, but also respect that parts of SOM are going for it and doing good. It's very important that you get these larger scale conditions out, and I respect some of this work, or Fuxas and so on. Fuxas himself isn't, but he has hired people and he's an instinct for this, and they allow them, that's the discourse coming through by whatever means necessary. If you hear Fuxas lecturing, you want to pull your hair out, how trivial and ignorant it is, and self-obscurantism. But somehow this firm can deliver pieces. I hope this is not going online with all these insights against China. This is kind of. I'm trashing everybody here. And you know, when architecture theory gets started, it was a kind of unsophisticated rote learning and so on. But there was also a real discourse. You read Alberti and Palladi and so on. Yeah. Look, let's make a quick short break.
Yeah.
Shall we do that?
Yeah.
We reached halftime, yeah. Yeah, I haven't had any breakfast. Let me just see what I have. Comprehensive theory of architecture. I call it the theory of architectural autopoiesis. And it's basically comes in two volumes. Volume 1, the first part, which is what is that? Plug that in. Why I call it the autopoiesis? Because it discourse, and the discourse is kind of self-propelling, self-creating. So all the resources of the discourse, its concepts, ideas, projects are elaborated and evolve from within it. There's no external. And this based on I will show you later, this based on an overall theory of society. As I said, architecture needs to be embedded in the theory of society, and another phrase for discourse, and I mean here discourse is always discourse practice, and oftentimes tied in, or more importantly tied in with professions. These are function systems, systems of communication, and that's Luhmann, and he uses the autopoiesis concept to see that these discourses are kind of self-making, self-propelling. Their communicative structures, institutions, trope, concepts, methods are self-elaborated. So it's a self-making of these discourses, which implies, and architecture is one of them, and that's why the autopoiesis of architecture, if you think about it as a discursive practice / profession, is self-evolving, and the autopoietic element is here is that it is also self-enclosing in a sense, that it develops its own trajectory independent from other discourses which run in parallel, like the engineering discourse, once it's separated out, like the political discourse, once that has been separated out, the economy and economic discourse. They are autopoietic in the sense of self-referentially enclosed, self-making trajectory, which of course look at each other, observe each other, and adapt to each other. And the overall it has no control center, so it's a kind of multiple strands notion of society and societal evolution without single fulcrum and control center and address where we could, because the political system isn't the master system. They can control science, knowledge. They also can control the production and reproduction of the built environment in terms of ideas and concepts, and for instance, and architecture. They're independent. So if Stalin comes in and wants to determine, and Hitler come in and want to determine architecture and the shape of the city, they kill architecture. They lapse back to some kind of primitivism. It's the same if the client wants this building to be certain, that's no longer architecture. And if a potentate comes in and, let's say, thinks that you could integrate these strands. Stalin also there was Lysenkoism, he tried to kind of have an ideologically forced science of biology that kills science, stops science in its tracks. So he stops science, he stops architecture. Another one is mass media communication as a discourse and profession, and he stopped that. So totalitarianism is a kind of relapse into a much earlier stage of society where you had the integration of whole societies through a multi-function control and power center, but now we have functional differentiation, and we have these kind of self-propelling, more or less incommensurable discourses which are observing and adapting to each other and fit with each other, because that's their survival criterion. That's the view of society which Luhmann offers, and within that I'm developing the architectural strand and reflecting, first of all, so volume 1 is basically describing how architecture functions as a discourse discipline. What are its resources, its primary concepts? Also trying to understand what it is for role in the global functional division of these strands. So functional differentiation means that each of these strands takes care over certain exigencies or problem domains it's a division of labor of sorts. Whereas before, kind of everything had to be done through the one power center. Now it's a division of labor. And we have to understand what is the societal function of architecture around which acted as this kind of strange attractor for the evolution of that subsystem, as it's around which it which became its kind of driver and raison d'etre. And that can be done. Luhmann did this with many different subsystems: the political system, the economic system, the legal system. They're all different and separate. They have their own discourse, and they all have their literatures. As I said earlier, they all have a theory line. So there's jurisprudence, discourse, and it's all started more or less at the same time. The main jurisprudence comes out of, crystallizes out of political discourse, and also in the, let's say, in the 17th century, 18th century. The economy started with an economic reflective discourse, the physiocrats in France, and then Adam Smith. So they have the literature. Economics is not is the kind of and so he's saying basically each of these function systems, he calls them. You can call them discourse practices / professions, have their own reflection theories. I mean they're reflective, guiding literatures or discourses as the part of the discourse practice, and without that it couldn't be. So you couldn't have a sophisticated legal system without a kind of reflective theory of jurisprudence. You couldn't have a proper political system without political theory, all the way through, as I said, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Hume, on economic. You couldn't have a proper economic system, so you had Adam Smith was instrumental to generalize the conditions of a capitalist flourishing, and the same you had with the laissez-faire economists in France, and so on and so forth. So that's the way, and we couldn't have architecture without the Albertis, Palladius, and the Sempers, and Muthesius, and Gropius, and so on and so forth. So we, in that view, you need to identify basically around which key task or aspect of societal functioning and flourishing was taken up by each of these discourses. So the question is, what is the societal function of societal contribution of architecture? And to answer this, you need to understand, we are shaping through ideas and discourses the making and remaking of the built environment. So what's the built environment? And then architecture within that. And my phrase is societal framing of social interactions. Because also other phrases, ordering of social processes, is all homing in on the same thing. And from yesterday's lecture, you realize, and I will come to that society needs that. There's no society without that framing. As sort of physically unframed, meaning basically it's a flock of primates in the forest. That's not human society. And you couldn't have a society of 1 million people without the kind of physical ordering matrix, or architectural ordering matrix, which is more than pure physical, which is also semiological ordering matrix. So that's the task, the key function, and it's a crucial and inviolable and absolutely necessary condition of all societal functioning. Since the very inception of humankind and societal evolution till today. And we shouldn't expect that we could make the next step of progress without reshaping the built environment. And that's why we need architectural revolutions. We couldn't continue. That's why we needed the iconoclasts of the late 1670s, the postmodernists, to trash up modernism. to allow the built environment to adapt to the new conditions. So that's, and if you, so the formula is the innovative framing of, and innovative, you know from before, we always, architecture, the whole point is accelerating innovation. Because if you've discovered something, you just reproduce it. You don't need a discourse so much as you just keep doing what you're doing, what you know you're doing. Which is always framing of social interaction, but with each project, there's a small, ever so small innovation. Even though I said some mainstream are just, you know, there's a chance at least for an innovation. And we feel like this in each new project, and in particular with a self-respecting, prominent firm, with each project you try, there is something. Anyway, so, and if you look at framing of interaction as the formula, is not, I'm not discovering something new, I'm just giving a new perspective on something we always knew. Giving form to function. This is the formula, since Alberti basically. He didn't use that phrase, but so the frame is the form and the interaction is the function. So we're focusing on social, societal. Look, function is also, within a machine, an engineering problem, the combustion chamber has a certain function, or the lever, but I'm talking about social function, societal function, in the interaction of buildings, not that technical function. It's a subsidiary. So when I talk giving form to function, I mean always a societal function, primary purposes, and that is the formula for all design disciplines, including, by the way, and that's why the challenge of cyberspace and where communication and interaction moves virtual or moves telecommunication, moves through screens and internet, this is colleagues. Because they are also the same discipline. They have the engineers, the coders, and hardware engineers, and they have the designers who design the interface, the layout. They're using form, color, hierarchy, foreground, background. They're designers. They have the same, they're giving form to function. How do you, the roll scroll down menu, how do you place in Facebook, you know. Their colleagues are in the same business as we are. They're designers. They're part of the designers. The kind of delivery team, of course, like our delivery teams, has also engineers on them. We need to identify the designers. So the designer is not only doing the iPhone, everything is an interface of communication. So the iPhone, it's how it sits in the hand, how I look at it, put in the pocket, all of that, user perspective. The user perspective is the architect's perspective. The engineer is not the user's perspective. It comes secondary. Once we know what the user experience should be, we then have technical means towards that. But also, of course, the way these apps sitting there as a grid, the way they disappear, the way that fillet, and so on. That's design. So graphic design is a very important part of design. So, and what once I point to is you can see that if you generalize from there backwards, all design is communication design, all design is kind of a semiology of sorts, even architecture. Anyway, but what I'm showing here, that framing interaction is giving form to function. And it's very important that the essential societal raison d'être purpose of architecture as a discipline, which had itself differentiated out and crystallized in the Renaissance already, that there is this historical continuity in the categories, and that I'm actually picking up the categories which evolved. Although the function category is not explicit in Alberti, but the distinction is clearly there, the ideas and the innovations thrust is there. The phrase of function came in the 19th century through biology, and in France, Viollet-le-Duc talks explicitly about functions, and so on. There's also inspirations through the idea of biological part-whole relations and functions, but it doesn't matter. The categories have a long, long lineage. So the functions architects address refer to clusters of social interaction understood as parts of social systems. For instance, the function type residence frames families or households. The function type school frames the respective social system, the institution of schooling, etc. So that's important, the framing of social processes, the social interaction. And in Luhmannian terms, all social interactions are always already part of a system of communication. We come to that. So in this case, spatial or spatiomorphological communication could also say, because we're working with space, form, and of course, color, texture. And I think communication, I would say, is the core competency. And of course, it's this kind of shorthand of it. It is ordering through communication, but also the physical ordering is still in there. But I'm focusing on here on communication, and therefore built environments become information rich. They become complex, but also contain a lot of information about themselves, because they should communicate and become transparent in their offerings and opportunities. Wait, let me see. So, and this core competency, the means and tropes and repertoires evolve along with the increasing complexity and dynamism, let's say, of societal processes which you need to frame. If they're very simple and very stable and operate through separating out without much interaction and so on, then you have a different architectural repertoire at play than if these processes become more dynamic, more integrated, more fluid between them, and so on and so forth in terms of social institutions. So that calls for a new kind of repertoire, also a new set of values, and that means you get a new paradigm within architecture about the repertoires, resources, and values through which you do that job. That job stays the same throughout all of the history of architecture since the Renaissance. In general terms, social ordering, and let's say, I said earlier, organizing and articulating the social process, and therefore framing, shaping it through that. That stays the same, but as societal processes become more complex, varied, and changing of character, we need to do that with it calls for these kind of different paradigms, and that these are the epochal styles. And but also, since we're embedding architectural theory in an overall theory of society, we need to also understand how is contemporary society functioning, and how is it different from, for instance, the mid-20th century. So we need to understand where we are historically. We need to also try to appraise where we're going to some extent. You can't kind of be too far in the future, but whether we have identified patterns of societal restructuring which will roll out more and more and continue, and that is a kind of post-Fordism discourse, and then tie in the architectural repertoires to this, so that we know that that the tendencies we are identifying as progressive, that we're predicting they would spread, that we gear up as avant-garde architects our repertoires and ways of working to these progressive tendencies, which will spread out. So and that's why I'm saying, if you take an example like Google, and you see more and more this kind of, let's say, startup culture and different way of working and living, urban renaissance spreading. And it's been spreading for 20, 30 years. So this will spread further and intensify further, because this is where the productivity gains are in the knowledge economy, where you don't have to distribute people in the suburbs and put them all on the assembly line and so on. That goes by itself. They converge into the center to have research, development, marketing, financing, innovation. And so that continues. And that changes lives, that changes everything. So we need to understand these tendencies, and we should gear our architectural repertoires, methodologies, and ways of working and what we value, complexity, dynamism, making that legible, making it integral, mixed use. I mean, a lot of these things are common sense. That you reject the strict zoning because society isn't like this anymore. It doesn't function like this. So these recipes have to be rejected, and new recipes have to develop, and you need new repertoires to develop them. And you need so that is key to grasp. And so something like post-Fordist network society we need to understand and read up on. And so this is not something I invent. This is something, as an architectural theorist, I have the responsibility to guide the discourse. So I need to know, not be an original contributor and inventor of social theory, of economic restructuring, or the political, how this pans out in the political realm, for instance, as in terms of neoliberal politics. I need to know about it, appraise it, and then draw the consequences and be original in my discipline to adapt my discipline to these things, to these tendencies which others have identified. So the post-Fordism discourse, something I've absorbed and I found compelling, and that then becomes a reference. And of course, there could be other theorists who say, hey, no, they get it wrong. Society is actually going somewhere else. But the ideas, even if it's not always under the phrase of post-Fordism, they've been understood, described, theorized hundreds of times. It's the information society, it's the knowledge society, it's things like patchwork. I mean, there's many descriptions of this. Pick one phrase, there's a big convergence, and there's different nuances of this. There's also those which saw this socioeconomic restructuring, but thought political consequences would be more kind of radical democracy, more kind of on the left side of things, and others were more about kind of entrepreneurship and getting the state out of the way, neoliberal kind of political recipes. So there's controversy in this, but there's an overall convergence. This civilization, through its socioeconomic discourses in sociology, economics, etc., has understood itself. And you should read up and bring yourself as an architecturalist to that level of where the civilization has reached its self-description. And then that becomes the background in which you now theorize how architecture fits into this and give, therefore, the self-description of architectures. Contribution to that. And that's basically the orthopoesis of architecture sets the frame, and then the theory of pragmaticism and the program of pragmaticism is the answer, as it were, which plugs into post-Fordist restructuring, which plugs into neoliberal political restructuring, and there's other things which are affected by this. For instance, which parallel this. For instance, in the sciences, maybe the shift into complexity theory. There are certain themes which migrate across. Complexity theory, self-organization. So also in all these domains, the tools come in, similar tools. For instance, you have fascinatingly, in sociology, you have agent-based computational sociology as the latest paradigm. And I'm talking about computational, agent-based computational architecture, agent-based computational semiology, architectural semiology. We're talking the same as in economics. You have recent paradigms of of agent-based computational economics. Agent-based simulations are involved in science, so there's parallels. So this discourse has its own purpose, its own tasks. But of course, it looks whether there's resources and advances which can be shared on the tool level, but also on the intellectual level. So that's where, for instance, post-Fordism as a transformation of the civilization, initially through the microelectronic revolution and telecommunication and the setting of, on the level of, let's say, cultural discourse is actually modernism to postmodernism, postmodernist discourse, French philosophy, is something we absorb because that's on the level of culture studies and cultural reflection. They reflect these changes, and that becomes an input. But even also on the categorical side, in terms of self-description, then it has to be more light-footed, and we can't be essentialist about one's categories because they're too fluid to allow this. So and philosophy is a discourse which in a sense shuttles between these different, the new science, complexity theory, new cultural phenomena and its description of humanities, new architectural recipes. So they shuttle between them and make it quicker that these different disciplines learn from each other. Because you as an architect, in each discipline, you can't read up all these strands. The philosopher will read up all these strands and kind of distill it to some kind of, and you can see that the kind of the interchange mechanism, that they actually have far higher sales volumes than in each individual discipline. Because all innovative, whether it's an innovative, with slightly time lags. So, for instance, I'm also very familiar with corporate managerial discourse in this restructuring. They discovered, in the end, Derrida and Deleuze, let's say, and so so someone like Deleuze is kind of going through all these domains and abstracting and making it available to all these domains. Right. This is something, a bit of a meta-argument that, so if you accept this, that there's a convergence in society's self-descriptions, and therefore there's some kind of truth, inverted commas, about where society is going, and if that can be kind of characterized with degrees of precision and different nuances, then there is something to go by. And then we set the task of, and if society is going somewhere, it's not going in lots of opposite directions. And if somebody's trying to go in opposite direction, they will be aborted very quickly. So for instance, Venezuela is on the wrong, gets history badly wrong, and that leads straight into starvation, chaos, revolution, and that strand will be aborted. So in the end, you can see the same thing with the neoliberal revisionists. However, the left dislikes them. It became a universal tendency of transforming of policies, including China. Deng Xiaoping, the great reformer of China, was influenced by Thatcher. And so a figure like Hayek, my favorite political philosopher and economist, is been influenced. This was Thatcher, Reagan, Deng Xiaoping, and all the kind of subsidiary transformations. These are compelling. Even Sweden came around to some extent. Even Sweden was so free, had so prosperous and coherent and high productivity, they could sustain socialism a little longer. They also had to cave in and learn the lessons. So if there's some kind of compelling set of advantages in certain structures and dynamics of society, that and if you try to resist this, you kill yourself as a society. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, North Korea, England if it goes Corbyn. Then there is certain objective tendencies, potentials, which we need to recognize, and they will. It's not arbitrary, and they favor certain over other forms of urbanization, forms of city building, and the way buildings within it look like, because institutions have a certain character within these dynamics and within these systems. Then there is, however broad and multiple in its subsidiary articulation and possibilities, it excludes certain things. So if Venezuela tanks with its systems, a modernist city or a minimalist Chipperfield, let Chipperfield have his urban dream, this will tank. Of course it doesn't tank as badly, but it would highly compromise the dynamism and vitality of a city if you put him in charge and let his kind of wet dream of a city come true. So we can't go in all directions at the same time. So the same thing you have to realize that so all these retros, the neo-minimalist, neo-modernist, the neo-pomo, even worse, the neo-historicist. So give Leo Krier become the master city builder of the planet. Sorry, it's not going to. Although even Krier has some it was part initially of in the progressive modernism smashing. I mean, they're muted into something strange where they're now good for retirement villages, but they're not good to construct the metropolis. So we got to take a stance, or at least try to realize that our task as a discourse is to define the best way forward for architecture, which matches up with the best way forward with respect to political systems and reforms. And they're parallel. Certain set of reforms spread around with their work. Economic policies or ways of doing businesses, outsource or die. Open up your higher corporate hierarchies or perish. Corporate culture, reformation, these become compelling things. So you can't stand aside or have, this is about what works. And there's also architectures that work or don't work in relationship to the outsourcing and network corporate and the broken down hierarchy and the internal fluidity and so on. So that has an architectural consequence on which city that works and which city it doesn't work. So it's not the only way. There's no only way forward. But there are multiple offerings. There's the way the Chipper wheel forward, the Leo Krier way forward. There's a Neo-Pomo, the Eric Owen Moss way forward. And we need to rank them, at least. I'm not saying I'm the only one because somebody came up with a better version. We need to take a stance and say which one is the best one, and then we should converge towards that and stop doing those dead ends, or some of them are really leading kind of highly compromising, some of them are better, but still we are much better here. So why should anybody invest in this anymore? Because we need all the help to make this forward, and this spreads out then. But these branches need to be aborted. We need to converge, spread, and converge. Yeah.
What happens if we're actually, from, again, the evolutionary perspective, being thrown by this kind of local opinion or this kind of fake optimum solution? Because we are...
Of course. It's still better. It's really local optimum. It's like, I don't believe what Neil said yesterday, that everything exists already in virtuality. So, in a kind of, so if nobody had the idea of look, there might be, we cannot see into the far future. What we can see is a local optimum. We should drive towards it.
It might be one that limits us much more than maybe
Look, yeah, but that's vain speculation. Look, that's what I'm saying. I don't demand the convergence of 100%. But at the moment we have this movement, which I think has the answers, is only 5%. This should mushroom to 50% of the profession, 60, 70%. I'm not saying 100%.
because I think there should be some exploratory branches that
I agree that, but at the moment we have
no, I agree that we have
convergence doesn't mean an absolute, and then you individual, so in certain things we could say, okay, yes, if one person goes on a tangent, I'm not going to shoot him, but some
kind of interesting thing.
and that's what we have to praise. How I think the Leon Krier we can happily abort and discourage. I would discourage anybody, because I know these characters, not because it comes with the whole package. It's so blockheaded, because they refuse. They're actually drawing on cardboard in ink. And they make their plan hat is an ornate, hand-labeled plan label. That's where they're going. There's an RIBA historical architecture group that exhibit these things. Yeah, you can do a villa like this, a restoration of a villa. They're good at restoring old houses, because they spend their time going into the minutiae of a brick and a mortar and a detail and an ornament and so on, and then they can recreate that. That would have spent their life energy on. So if you think, look, if that becomes a fashion and 20% of our profession, it's like, look, it's not an extreme case, but I agree, but the point is, because look, it's a monumental task, and we're not enough of us doing this. Look at the School of the AA. I just wanted to find out. I would say it's 10% who are doing productive work in the direction of what should be. Not that everything else is not. Nothing to contribute, but highly tangential and partial. So, and it's this is tragic. The same with GSD, with Columbia. This is, and it has a false ideology of pluralism, where you don't allow to criticize these directions. You don't allow to say, this is backward, this is unsophisticated, yesteryear's backward recipes, and should be aborted, ideally. Or, it shouldn't be given credence. This airtime and discussion space and work time is limited. We can't afford, and I agree that there's some margin always of, and I'm not talking about any force, I'm just talking about the force of the compelling argument. It's just putting discursive pressure, just probing people. And I think we should feel that in a public debate, in a discourse, you need to challenge each other. You need to take responsibility of what you're doing. Otherwise, you shouldn't be when you cop out, I don't think you deserve, you kind of exit the conversation if you say, well, no, but I don't know, I don't have the answer, leave it, let me ask me in 2 years. Or, no, I don't know why I'm doing this, I just want to do it. It's kind of, then you're no longer participating in the communication. You have to make arguments which become compelling for me, why I should also do this. No. You want me to do this well? No. You all have your own interests. No. I don't have the convictions here. I'm not confident that everybody should do this. But I just want to do it. So you think nobody else should do it? It's up to them. And that's where we think at the moment, that lacks this. We don't get this kind of discourse is basically a dysfunctional discursive culture. So you have this kind of meta. You have to critique the discursive culture as being, at that time, degenerate. Yeah.
Visualizing the position in some kind of, let's say, diagrammatic phenomenon. Let's say, I see that everything in the universe organized in system is kind of strange. I agree with they have coherence, but they also, let's say, they branch and they create a complex structure. What I'm getting from, I might be wrong, or I hope I'm wrong, from your position is that you're actually kind of push for this kind of concentric or let's say convergence towards one point.
Well, not one point, no. It's just relative. It's all relative, comparative. I'm saying at the moment we're so spread out, we're going in.
Yeah,
so we need, that's dissipative. That's not, if you have a task, if you are a posse in a guerrilla warfare, and you discuss strategies, you can't have all 5 strategies simultaneously executed. Then all of them will collapse. And we are collapsing because what have we impacted? 20 years in? What have we changed? The cities are still garbage heaps and trash. We haven't impacted. We are failing. We are on a suicide mission. The discipline makes itself irrelevant. It doesn't fulfill its historical mission. So we are this posse who is trying to kind of make way, and we are dissipating and flopping, right? So that's the problem. So we got to, and this is a difference. So I think that the modernists, they got it right. They were converging into a force, and it started very small. Look at the Bauhaus, a small group, where they reinvented urbanism, architecture, industrial design, fashion design, graphic design, and look now, Bauhaus, graphic Bauhaus, everything Bauhaus. They've ripped through this planet, and before it was all this kind of fluffy-duffy world, a day different world. Villages, they looked like the medieval, and now look at the world. And this starts with a discourse, a few protagonists who got it, who realized something behind the scenes of architecture. They were building in factories and silos and ships, and they got it. Hey, this is something. And it was Mies, Gropius, and Korb. They were in Behren's office, a small group. 1915. 1965, they look back in their own lifetime, everything was transformed in their own image. All the way to India, Africa, through everything. And I like that story. And this generation should do the same, should aspire to the same. And it was for the better, because I don't think we could have this level of prosperity of the 60s for millions, for literally every single German citizen of the 1960s, 60 million of them, to have the industrial lifestyle. It wasn't only them; it was also the scientists. It was but it was also the designers. Because if you were insisting, like the 19th century did, that the city had to be stone, symmetry and proportion, and full of, how could have you had 60 million people and that it had to be a kind of a bounded urban environment, and then you had to, and it's like, and so I think that's what I'm talking about, is waking up to the historical mission. And it demands that we understand what our mission, and there's also that we have to have a proper discourse where we challenge each other to probe. Look, and I said, why is the discourse so degenerate? And I tell you why. Because after modernism collapsed, there were no clear recipes. You had to have a free-for-all. It's like the brainstorming. The firm is at the edge of bankruptcy. All the strategies of marketing have collapsed. The product is all wrong. The way they've been treating their worker with this hierarchy is dysfunctional. They still have some resources left. They're put in a brainstorming chamber. Everything goes. They're desperate. Any new idea. What could we do? You throw everything out. Then you need to, at that you have a kind of anything goes, everything is equal, nobody is disqualified. The most weird and absurd idea can be thrown into. That's this openness, where the Mavericks come in, the Frank Garys, the Wolf Prixes, Zaha, with their radical intuition, they get space. Now, and they open up a lot. But if they want to impact, then you have the next step. You have to start analytically sifting that and say, this is an idea here, and why, and why, and why, and we're going this way. So then it's kind of, after you start doing this, then it's no good anymore to just throw in sideways, or then, you can't have it brainstorming for in this company for the next 5 years. You have that for a few months. And then you start gradually homing in, and within that there's still uncertainty, there's subsidiary brainstorming, but no longer here. Not so, no, what I want to do. No, I'm sorry. You're fired. We're working here now. And then it's crystallized and becomes ever more rigorous. When you look at modernism, the way it was initially contemporary art, the Bauhaus already weeded out the Oskar Schlemmers, the Kandinskis, the dreamers, the strange kind of, the Pleshniks, they were out. Because it was crystallizing, and then it was scientificizing. And then look at and then if you go in the 60s, the introduction of cybernetics and rigorous and modeling and science. And we need to reach that again, and that's part of the rollout. Look at Hannes Meyer taking over the Bauhaus. He said, okay, we had enough of art. The artists have served their purpose. It's a bit like that brainstorming. And to some extent, yes, the Wolf Prixes and Garys have served their purpose. And actually, anyway, they were theory-led, embedded with the Chumis and Eisenmans and Colasses, which were instrumental. But also, they have outserved their purpose because an Eisenman doesn't have a full vision. So they need. But if we don't do it, our lives will be all wasted. Because what have we done? These buildings, drops in the ocean. You got to be more ambitious than that. I want to be ambitious as Mies. Look, Mies looking at the Chicago skyline with satisfaction. The Seagram buildings in 1958, standing there in this kind of stone Art Deco universe. Snapshot 30 years later, the remaking of that whole New York in its image. Because these were compelling advantages. But then, of course, history changed, dynamics changed, and all of this is bankrupt now. That's why I love this image. And Jenks got it right. You needed a revolution. He showed this kind of Pruitt-Igoe mass satellite housing, which was far more potent than the kind of slums and villages, which were the subsidy. Dynamited symbolically and really. And there's the end of this. So what was a fantastic idea and huge success, and not a mistake, had to stop and transmute it into a next stage, and to continue it, wanting to continue it, is a huge mistake. But I love the modernism story because it's a story of convergence and kick-ass transformation of the planet. And they converged because in the 1960s, everybody was a modernist, including, they just recently gave this Indian guy, Dashi, a Pritzker Prize. So the convergence was pretty much complete. That means an architect in 1960 you're a modernist architect who knows, who's fully absorbed and brought himself to the level of the paradigm of modernism. There's just a lot of different things we can go to, the full analysis of what modernism is, what's different about any previous style, and its advantages, its power, but of course you can also talk about the failings and how. But it is the architecture of the Fordist era of mechanical mass production, which ties in with social democracy, which ties in with certain type of mass media, which is millions of run of one newspaper and one TV channel, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to see that kind of historical fitting, and then you have the transformation, and then you have a kind of new revolutionary, So similar to the revolution from historicism into modernism was also kind of one of mavericks and fermentationists, you know, but also intellectual leaders. You know, as I said, Van Dersburg and Elisitsky. They contributed, you know, abstract art, Dadaism, all of that. And this wasn't directly, it's still connected into design disciplines. So the theory, the overall history of theory is this kind of thing of, it's not a linear progress only. If you go far, it's always about higher and higher performance, meaning we now can feed billions and only half of them have to work. You only work when you're 25 or 26 and stop working. You take that flight to Australia, sipping 20 coffees, 5 movies. So the potency of progress is clear. Now, how does it, but it moves through, it's not linear. It has these kind of runs. It's like cycles of innovation. And then you have disruptions and new technologies, and then you have kind of revolutionary periods and cumulative periods. And it's interesting that this is also something I borrowed from the sciences. They went through this. So the Kuhnian notion of the structure of scientific revolutions, the idea of paradigm and paradigm shift, is an analogy. But history has always been like this. It's a kind of, it's a shifts between revolutionary and cumulative trajectories, and then because they're kind of exotic, like endogenous shocks. For instance, the discovery of things like the steam engine and mechanical power, or later on electric energy and electrification, or things like the print media, photography and cameras, or telegraphy, and the big one for us is computational power. That's the big. So in the final analysis, it's technological. Oftentimes is the key, but then you need lots of things to make this work, organizationally, politically, architecturally, to make that thing.
So at the moment, the driving force for as you define it, is let's say, the computational revolution, or
Okay.
is it the disruptive moment, or is it like
The computational revolution is one of the key drivers for the necessity of a total societal remake, because the opportunities of empowerment were so huge, but to get at them, a lot of things have to change. Now it empowers each individual. It becomes a tool in all disciplines, but it's also for architecture. It's not only our tools, but also the way society has been changed through all of this. That new dynamism, complexity, globalism, all of these aspects which become so it comes in, the computational revolution is the trigger, has lots of consequences to make it work. There's an overall prosperity search, but the conditions under which each now has to fit in is very, very different. But also we can use these tools to make this fitting possible. And we have to, and we should, and if we don't, then it's crazy that a kind of universal intelligence tool, like computational intelligence and power, isn't used by any professional discipline. The finance is using it. Financial trading algorithms, blockchain money. I mean, medical is using it. Science is using it. Economics is using it. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So even on that level, before you come to what you now do with this, if there's an architectural paradigm which keeps working and doesn't need to use it even, already shows that they're not using the potential. Also, everything remains changed, and they keep stable because they have no project and they don't need this. And the thing is, parametricism, you say, oh, don't make everybody the same. No, not the same. This parametricism is a universe of differentiating, flourishing of subsidiary styles and projects and perspective. But at least they share one thing. They're computationally empowered, and they are after complexity, dynamism, integracy, We should do thousands of things. All I'm saying with the convergence, stop all this rest. Stop all the retro shit. You know what I mean? But the problem is 90% of us doing the retro shit are preoccupied by the retro shit. So convergence is at the one time to kind of converge out of this retro shit into a space and then also find each other there. But there's lots of branches and sub-branches. So parallelism is super abstract in general. It's because I'm defining it in the most general sense. I'm demanding it is computationally kind of empowered, self-empowering. But also I'm demanding it that, I'm only very, very general, that I'm saying these kind of heuristics are super abstract. I'm saying, you stop going with rigid hermetic forms like triangles, circles, spheres, cubes as your repertoire. They're not going to, because every form needs to become adapted, flexible, self-differentiating. You stop endless repetition. Of course, symmetry and proportion was already trashed by modernism, so that's out anyways. And you're saying, so there's a series of very, very general characteristics. So there are minimal conditions of being part of contemporary architecture and a self-respecting contemporary architect. You need to meet these conditions. And if you meet these conditions, you're within parametricism. That's it. It's actually setting up a huge proliferation of creative projects.
I think that your term, as you coined it, is completely distorted in the perception of 99% of people.
Yeah.
Maybe computationalism or some kind of other expression would be more correct in the sense that it probably would take.
Well, look, parameters are very, very, it says dependency on parameters. Look, I had to come up with a phrase. But anyway, I said yesterday in the meeting that no matter how much you self-differentiate, there's an objective movement of cross-fertilization of a group. And unfortunately, it excludes lots of people. We are a minority. And also, we need to then self-criticize. We first criticize within the discipline. We criticize all these guys and trash them and make them feel really bad. And then we need to, within the field, we need to self-criticize there to say, hey, I have to probe Roland, and okay, it's great, but, what's the next ambition here? How does this fit in? Or upgrade the kind of theoretical repertoire, and you can still do your project, and but then also kind of guide that project into something which is task-oriented. And look, there are several tasks. It's not one task. I mean, there's urbanism, and there's architecture, and there's institutional building, there's residential. So there's these various trajectories, but they all share something because they all have. None of them will go by the moods and modes of repetition, or none of them functional domains will go by strict separation. But they would go where they look for integration and spaces and process communicating, be inter-aware and so on. So I think certain features of the civilization and its congenial spatial facilitation that one can characterize on an abstract general level. And that would be the minimum requirements for being on the right track. And you prevent, it's like the medical profession, you can't refuse gene technology or gene therapy or the idea of crafting therapies with degrees of individuality, for instance, right? If you can. If you can and it's beneficial, you should, and not someone saying, I don't believe in that. Sorry? Oh, I don't believe in parameters. Excuse me? It's like I don't believe in gene therapy or in genetics.
Is the solution to, let's say, morphological and social, what we call social functional, does it have to do, I'm using in my research the idea of hybrid, like social function, approach, and also hybrid morphologies in a way. From your perspective, how are you designing your projects within the framework of parametricism in terms of, again, coping with this kind of separation? Before we kind of clear separation of functions. We have the polyfunctional stuff. Now we're reaching the hybrid. Do you think that the hybrid buildings, hybrid architecture, is the correct response to which fits best of our
Yeah. And I will have later on, we get there tomorrow, maybe much more visual illustrated, the advantages.
I was just wondering if you have another model which is even better than that.
Well, look, there's also, the hybrid came out as part of, the deconstructivism has the hybrid already. So the first one is the postmodernism had the collage. Deconstructivism was emphasizing not only that they could be next to each other, that they could interpenetrate and overlap, and there could be places multiple. Great. Parametrism has, anyway, my version of it, it's not everybody else's version, maintains all those and more, that these layers are not thrown over each other randomly, but they start to inflect each other, resonate with each other, one indicating the other, inferring back to each other. And deconstructivism wasn't generalizable because the complexity, it collapses into white noise chaos and becomes illegible. So and this is also things you discover when you work on these things. Let's say some of the discoveries of what later became parametrism was done in Zaha's office through the potency of curvature and of gradients and of a more quasi-physics in quasi-physics engines. Because if you use splines, French curves, splines, or if you use the fastness of the hand, you have the kind of you have the rhythm and poise and lawfulness of the line, which isn't just a dumb straight line, which was the rest of deconstructivism. And she used kind of washes and gradients and dot blurs instead of just block color. So you discover these things, and then you feel, interesting. But also discover when you work like this, and the project has all the ingredients, all the relationships, all the complexity of embeddedness, but this looks like a shit of piece of junk, and this one is like, whew, super sexy. Graspable, you find your way in this complexity, whereas here you've been lost already in the complexity. No, but look, you have to trust our intuition. So, here it becomes kind of aggressive.
Sorry, let's pick up on the comment that Valerie made. How do we get beyond subjective positions?
Through discourse.
Well, but I'm thinking here because at one point, I'll make a comment, but we were talking about the art world and as a kind of world that had no function. Now, that's not actually what Adorno would say, or indeed neuroscience. There's a function of aesthetics in terms of, in say, Damasio's terms, it's about kind of maintaining a kind of homostatic condition in some way, but therefore actually design has a social function. And
of course, but art has one as well, but not individual artwork.
But I think we need to get to a position where we can find some objective way of establishing what is the most effective
exactly.
means, which is not just a kind of matter of taste or
exactly.
subjective viewpoint.
That's what I'm talking about. That means we need to, that's why this idea, but I like this, that's taboo. That's an exiting from the discourse. The discourse can only be entered with saying, no, we should do this because of the advantages. And what you're proposing has these disadvantages and problems. That's why we should not do that. So then the premise is that means we're searching for the objective in the sense of what compels, you could call it the intersubjective, so it's some kind of consensus around what's best. Relatively speaking, of course, there could be local optimum. It's not the only way. Maybe even several nearly similar good ways. But there's plenty of worse ways which we need to weed out. And that's why the subjective position, the subjectivism of saying, no, but this kind of relativism, subjectivism is very kind of anti-progress, because that is nearly a stance which means that there's no point in this discourse. Anyway, everybody is doing what they like, and nobody can know what's better. So what's the point? Oh, we're just exchanging ideas so that we each of them kind of can do our thing and might get another thing to do, but it's inconsequential. This also means that this is committed that architecture doesn't make really a difference. People often say, well, it doesn't matter, anything could happen in any building. Yes, to some extent, but if it really doesn't matter, then why are you in this field? I would exit that field straight off. I would have never entered this field if I believed that it makes no difference. But I've told you that, whole becoming human was based on this. And so if you need to just probe somebody saying these things, and you get them into a self-collapse where they have to exit the discourse very quickly, and you say, oh, how brutal. Well, for the sake of, that means we have to come to the point to realize which positions to take, stances and projects are meritorious, are sustainable, are contributing, and which discourse is just pretense and the waste of resources, the waste of airtime.
Maybe just clarify what you mean.
Particularly if we have everything publicly funded and you in the end have kind of free riding on the base of pretense and in the base of refusing discourse.
The two models of success that we've been talking about, this one is parametricism and one is Bauhaus, which is a very...
Which one?
The Bauhaus.
Yeah.
A very different aesthetic regime. So why could one not entertain the Bauhaus today?
Because we live in a different era.
So
This was Fordism. It was good for Fordism. It's not good for post-Fordism.
We're actually posting that we should have a new sexy, generally accepted, so we should shift from the
totally.
curves to some kind of like slim fit to what we have now, and maybe some kind of
Tectonism. At the moment, the best thing we can go for, we should love, is tectonism. So we should not like anymore, and I don't like them. Look, it comes still out of the office, I tolerate it. It's hard to do tectonism good. You need so many more skills and intuitions and skills. So I need to hire Achim and his whole team to do proper plus. But it's not enough because he can't deliver a whole project. I need all these guys working for us then I can do a proper project. So I shouldn't like, look, it's still better than others, but a project like the Dongdae is a great project, but it's deficient. Or the Galaxy project, they are blobism, we're in tectonism. So there are yesteryear's success, but since it's the best realization, we don't have tectonism realized on any scale. Maybe the Macau project, it comes close-ish, and therefore it's my favorite project at the moment on the planet. You self-criticize, and it's moving on. But the interesting thing is, it's all parametricism, so the paradigm, and the Dongdae and Galaxy stand tall in the history of architecture and in the sampling of best practice buildings on the planet. And but we've moved on, and so on and so forth. But the modernism is so dead. Foldism and blobism are dead. But theoretically dead. So a student project should not be a blobism project. In reality, it's hard to leap into tectonism. So we might have to do a few more blobism projects. It's not trivial, I have to also respect that. But modernism, died in the 70s. Or theoretically was dead in 1970. It lingered on, of course, because you can't...
One could argue that actually in some ways the Bauhaus failed, because it didn't, in the end, manage to convince the population. They went back to vernacular, traditional whatever stuff. But one
did convince largely.
But one could say that actually IKEA is successful. IKEA is successful.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's really, that is to my mind the triumph of the Bauhaus. So they did what the Bauhaus never managed to achieve, which is to make it affordable for the masses.
No. I agree with that. IKEA is another success coming out of the Bauhaus.
But that's the aesthetic of IKEA is not parametric on the whole.
Look, what happens in homes isn't the most advanced high performance arena, although it also matters there. that you look.
This might be more.
No. But I tell you, the Mac interface is a parametrism interface. When you scroll down, all the swelling and gradient and of the icons, the swooshing back, the Mac interface is kind of a parametrism, is a non-minimalist. It's not a modernist, and in a lot of graphic, where you have gradient backgrounds and anyways. But it's, of course, there's lots of projects. I've been challenging. I think the fashion world hasn't fully. That's why I'm trying to work on parametrism fashion, tectonism fashion. I think in graphic, it's also. There could be, what I wish is somebody like Casey Rees, and that graphic designer and web and interface designers use much more processing and sophisticated tools to make these sites more. I mean, there could be much more. So a lot of these disciplines are behind the curve. Industrial design, Ross Lufko is fantastic, but he is kind of weaning and whining, I mean, because he's an isolated incident in the world of industrial design, which is still, look, and I also feel that in industrial design, product design, furniture design is less critical than, the most critical is urbanism and architecture. Where parametrism on the larger scale, because we're talking about scale, complexity, integration, multifunctionality, the quick weaving from one condition to another. So there's more potent, but I also do feel that I can do that. Some of these that a sophisticated tectonism, parametrism, then it comes responsiveness, responsive environment style, apartment even, hotel room even, could be. We tried an hotel room. Could be a more sophisticated, better version, better and more empowering experience. Let's discuss that. But it's of course less critical.
It was a good discussion actually. Thomas, when you presented his portfolio, you showed that in Barcelona, I think Barcelona, some areas, urban areas, were actually completely, although very well designed from a perspective of urban design, they were completely unused just because the Wi-Fi coverage was not so. In the sense, these kind of little things like.
Sure.
I'm not sure I consider that this kind of urban architectural and then device approach is still.
Look, you know what is, for instance, what was fascinating me is when you say in the mid-90s we moved from folding into what was called hypersurface. So, and that's the way where the triple O guys are stuck. But what was interesting there in terms of stability, that you could have these kind of mappings and graphics, and you have the water pavilion, which had these kind of projections of interactive color and screen and so on, and we did. So and the idea comes up of cyberspace and of the integration of the real and the virtual. So I think our sensibility and also the extension and also into orchestrating projections and screens and so on in hyper-surface architecture, not that is an interesting advance and absorption, which minimalism would hate, because he wants concrete, the orgasm of concrete. He doesn't want to have screens everywhere. We're totally happy with totally, I would have screens, and every room being interfaced onto a virtual room. We would totally, we have no rejection of that. Whereas for Leon Krier could never entertain this. He has to, in the hotel room, he has to hide the TV screen. You have to elaborate unfolding of a cabinet to watch TV. And I want the whole wall to be a TV, and that becomes consistent, right? But so even on this level, there are little. It's not that advantages here, and of course IKEA is more advantageous than an Ampere kind of. And
was brilliant at actually getting one of the main important, like this kind of mass prefabrication and kind of, basically.
But look,
one of the advantages or
look at this chair. I mean, of course it's comfortable and all of that, but it's relatively heavy and it's kind of not. So if we do our 3D printed chair, not that it works yet, you can pick it up like on this hand, super light. We can optimize the body. And there's things. So this look at all costs and so on. But the potential even on a product for parametrism delivering, and it's also going to be cheaper because it could just print multi-material, multi-soft. It will be a quarter of the weight. Blah 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 blah. And then you look at this and say, what a clunky thing! What a yesteryear's kind of piece of crap. This is Bauhaus. This is the free, you know.
3D printing is also a minor innovation compared, for example, with what an interactive chair would be, which is
exactly.
interactive mind mapping, it's adaptive.
Yeah.
It would be very nice with some pins.
Yeah.
This guy, old guy, was almost dying, but he was always kept this kind of almost perfectly, let's say, the perfect position at all times based on this. I think that's the potential for it. Not moving from this to a lighter, slightly more fancy version of a chair, because then the improvement is minimal.
Of course, and there's also.
Who says that that's
but every little helps, you know.
So interactive design is the ultimate version of.
I do believe that.
You know what the other thing is?
Non-object based.
But the other thing is this.
Then if parallelism is about an aesthetic, how can you have an aesthetic that's mutating and changing?
Do you need an aesthetic when you're feeling amazingly good from something that is creating interaction, which is actually suiting your body? Is it beautiful in itself, or do you?
No, but you know what you need aesthetics for? You need to like it.
To like it?
You need to like it because you could.
Like the experiences.
Sure. But you also need to. We have this. We have these cliches. We want to be cool. It has to become the cool thing.
I cannot add these to it. That's not the problem. No, the thing is that
No.
I think it's an interesting discussion. The love for object. I think we also need to. In your discourse, we need to ditch that. We don't have to.
You look,
object anymore.
But I accept some aspects of invariant human psychology and also see its effect. So if the kind of fetishistic imitation, trend following psyche helps for a lot of those guys who don't know what's good for them, who don't know why this is better. They just follow fetishistically what's cool, and that's good because there's leadership in what's cool. There's we the elites of the discourse. Actually, I don't mind if there's an information loss, but at least the right stuff is disseminated for the wrong reasons. But there's a kind of rational operating. So, but this chair, for instance, what I'm talking about, what is also there's another effect, even of that chair. It's not only lighter, multi-material, but I can produce many versions. But the variations also in the following sense. We'll come to this later. That if all the chairs of this school could carry additional information about the different types of participants in different rooms, they keep mutating. There's the version in a network of contrast and similitude. There's a kind of language variation, a semiotics, which would be parametric semiotics, where this one fails because it is a mass reproduction thing. It's just saying and. Whereas we want to speak much more subtly about which atmosphere, which condition, which type. There's a space with diverse chairs. There's a more equal. Here's a hierarchy where this chair is a bit lifted up, and we fall into place, and we can shuffle them and reshuffle them. So there's also a not only ergonomics and variation where this would adapt to a body, but there's semiology, and I come to this later, where I also need parametric and 3D printing, because then I can be much more subtle in my utterances, so I can have dialects and inclinations and intonations in my objects to make them more subtly and relative to each other in an orchestrated atmospheric condition, which if you have only this chair in the whole school, then it doesn't tell you about the different places the school has.
But you're also pragmatist, because I think that in your own discourse, one of the criticisms I can add to your, I think it's self-imposed limitation, because you also, like you said, you have a fetish for object and for beauty as an object.
Yeah.
But I believe that if you want to actually grant the full power of pragmatism, we should go beyond the object space.
Of course. Look, that's just a shortcut.
Okay.
We need the rationality. The rationality needs to be argued for, understood, and then once you have established that, then you shouldn't worry that it also becomes loved. Because it's been loved for good, and because that's a shortcut. Because you can't, not everybody can penetrate the analytic reasons. You yourself also need to condition yourself, because you're not going to be analyzing each case. You need to develop intuitions, emotional responses, which pick out in a split second what's good for you, what's the better version. You should need to get a sensibility for this. So I don't even have to analyze. You get a fail-safe nearly intuition about, I'm picking this one. And because you have the right neural network, and this sometimes is non-discursive. So what is interesting about this whole discourse on the, let's say, or what we learned about artificial intelligence, that is black box non-discursive, and we are also in our aesthetic sensibilities, we're black box non-discursive intelligence, because of course this could be, some of us have sometimes the wrong sensibilities because they're not conditioned enough, not socialized enough. But most of us are relatively sophisticated and adapted to pick out if somebody behaving like an ass or is behaving inappropriately, meaning old-fashioned. It's usually old-fashioned. This guy, and I've had it here, is somebody that's still kind of sexist in his sensibilities, he can't hide it. It's like we should revolt. And we should instinctively not like the guy and then not mix with the guy anymore, not re-invite him anymore. And that we don't even have to reflect that. It's just an instinctual moral reaction, or the way this guy looks, instantly can see, I don't have to even talk to him. Because his penis tattoo on his forehead, I mean, it's much more subtle. And for different people, so we are inevitably, with our supercomputer here, navigating the world aesthetically as users. And you can say we should overcome that, good luck, but you can't rationalize everything, choice, every step with an analytic reflection. You don't have the time to do that. But then you kind of stand back and reflect at home the choices I've made and then you say, hey, gosh, I really still go for the wrong kind of, fall in love with the wrong girls, the wrong chicks. Stop doing this.
For anti-pragmatism, the nostalgia plays a really important part, because we're discussing about the chair, and all of us have this kind of mental representation of this, let's say, standard chair, or whatever, like Corbusier as well. And then when we move towards, let's say, advancing the technology, we still have this kind of nostalgic image imprinted in our mind. And think about a child, which is again, raised and born in an environment that
that's what we need. That's why we need aesthetic revolutions, and then we need these revolutions to disseminate, and we need to weed out old-fashioned fetishes.
To go the other way around, aesthetic revolution means that I'm turning the concept of the image of the chair into something else. While I do believe that by, again, how to call it, by experiencing something in a new way. For example, again, imagine a kid being born in a room where there is no chair, there's no room, everything is folding and there's
look, I don't think, the problem is this, that a lot of functionality. No.
Also colorful.
No, what I'm talking about is you think you can have when you sit in a chair, you get the better experience and it becomes compelling right away. That works for the chair. But a built environment, a building, it's harder to pin. So you need guidance. You don't know if it's a better and works better and its consequences and what contributes and what detracts So there you need some kind of architectural theory which then condenses into aesthetic values, and they become kind of shortcuts and intuitions you just need to be trained up to. So to some extent, you can be a good person by just, without having this reflective loop to some extent, by being trained up. Don't do this like a dog. The good dog and the non-socialized dog doesn't require the reflective rationalization in the dog. It just needs to be the reward and punishment sequence which beats somebody into a good person. So, and and you do it in aesthetic valuations by laughing at if they continuously show lack of taste, and reward them with admire them for their good taste. So they're just training them up to have good taste. And that helps them because they can navigate the...
Okay.
Sounds horrible when I'm talking about this, but you need to see the rationality of this, because I'm claiming that the good taste represents a successful navigation aid for you into the world. So you hate the tasteless people and you like the good taste. You follow and want to be close to good taste people.
I think that's the challenge.
Because
actually, to be honest,
it's not only taste, it means something.
most people don't have access to having exposed to certain kind of good taste. This is what I'm going to return to, because if you want to make it a universal style or aesthetic or whatever, in some ways you've got to find a way of actually appealing to that.
Yeah.
And that's why, in a sense, let's take postmodernism. What I think is interesting about postmodernity is you've got people like David Beckham wearing a sarong, appearing in glossy magazines, that also had some interior. So actually, that kind of seemingly superficial celebration of the aesthetic actually helped to introduce a certain aesthetic sensibility. And this goes back to my point about archaic, the fact that because people could afford it, it became the thing that you have in your household. And it proliferated everywhere.
Of course.
But because they had access to it, that's the kind of key question. How do you raise public consciousness about design to the point where you can get a universal style acceptance?
It's trickle down.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I'm saying. I think we have to look at it more holistically in terms of kind of like costs and things. If you could,
yeah, of course. Of course, cost matters. We shouldn't, and I don't. We shouldn't love things which are inherently, monumentally costly without delivering monumental performance advantages. So we shouldn't like that. And to some extent, we should therefore love the economical, but of course not just the economical, cost benefit. We need to value and fall in love with and pick out. You go into a shop, I love this one. And then you realize, then you make a 20-hour analysis of all these chairs, their pros and cons, economics, benefit fitting in. And then if this is a winning, you make a science analysis of this, and if this was the winning chair in analysis, the one you like most, then you have finely and beautifully attuned sensibilities. And we are relatively easygoing for this. For instance, in the car evolution, I think if you the best cars and each version in evolution. Look, there's also always a little irritation. We get used to something. When there's a new Mercedes comes out, there's something changed. I don't like it. The initial reaction is that. And then, later on I like it, and then I don't like the old version anymore. And if you line them all up, it becomes compelling. That means we have the right sensibilities. If we reject the one from 10 years ago, it's crude, the light's not fully worn in, there's no anti-classic curves, it's only it's the integration. There's so much refinement, even in something so standard of the car, where you know, and these guys are very full on parametricism. I mean, that's where they love us. BMW, Mercedes, Ferrari, they all run in our doors. They want to work with us, and all the designers are looking at our stuff, because they know it helps them to do the next thing. We are in inverse. We've been looking in architecture, in parametricism, we've been looking at car interiors for 20 years, and Nike shoes. But the Nike whole delegation comes to us as well. So it works as well. That's the static. And of course, these cars are also more high performance. And that Nike shoe is better and lighter. And we should pick it out. And the person who likes the kind of, there's this kind of fish, okay, these kind of sports shoes. That's a nostalgic fetish. Neil is far more with his yellow Nike aesthetically attuned. I'm sorry to pick you up.
It's a cheap one. You can't go to London with those ones.
Look, and then this leadership, there's this kind of, you don't know why, you see these people, you have to, of course.
But I actually understand what you're saying. The building market is a totally different thing. Like, you cannot expand this sort of, like, diffuse this idea to everyone through buildings. They will be dropped in the oceans. It's going to be much faster to the product.
No, but
what about, like, as we get through it, like, towards it, like AR and VR? I think that could be like, as we see today, everyone has an iPhone. This is accessible to everyone almost, even who cannot afford it. And they
That's
can
a problem. They make you buy it, although you can't afford it. It's a different problem.
Yeah.
No, the advantages are so compelling that you're happy. You would pay much more.
Depending on,
Rather than not having any.
again,
No, I say, I think that should after this.
Look, I think it can disseminate. It should become compelling, like the modernism, where these things rip through the whole planet. In architecture as well. Not the best versions, but the advantages. And it's interesting that, for instance, this kind of Cartesian towers, these articulated towers of which filled Hong Kong, was a kind of intuition which Corbusier already had. These kind of cross towers and corrugated towers. So there are certain things which, the advantages, look, now we don't find this beautiful anymore. But when they first appeared, they were kind of aspirational. So.
the problem with iPhone is that for quite a number of iterations, it didn't fundamentally change. It did in micro increments, but it didn't change fundamentally in terms of shape. Even shape was kind of iPhone 6 to 8 or whatever, to now 10.
Look, there's not always a justification to change them because, look, that's what I said also. Like Mies said, aesthetic revolutions, there's incremental, we're in a cumulative incremental phase. And there's a bit, tectonism was another little search, but it's within parametrism. We're not talking about, and Mies had said it, you don't need to reinvent a new architecture every Monday morning. And I say the same thing. Parametrism has been going for 25 years, and we shouldn't shift away from that. There's cumulative within the subsidiary styles, and we moved from Fordism and Blobism into tectonism, great, and that was another kind of subsidiary, but it was more like within modernism going from the white modernism into brutalism, into high-tech. The all modernism, there's another discourse, why they're all modernisms. They're the principle of separation, specialization, and repetition in all of these instances, and separation of subsystems, of parts of building, and repetition in each subpart. So a Pompidou and all the high-tech stuff is of course very different from a white modernism, but there's also a lineage. But radically different from postmodernism. And radically different from deconstructism and radically different from parametricism. So I'm not expecting, as I said, in my lifetime, any change away from that. Because that would require a civilizational, you can never know, transformative, huge new kind of, maybe it's coming through I don't know through what it might come and what the implications of it are.
No question, but it's actually interesting. We have the very rich, which actually go for the highest, the top-end car with the most technology included, and then they want a Roman villain in terms of, they want that kind of stuff. This is the main problem. My question is, should we try to build the equivalent in terms of housing or architecture of the highest top-end car that people will adopt because it has much more than just the aesthetical or the spatial characteristics.
But I think the cars, I saw these images, the car sensibility will shift radically. It shifts away from the Ferrari to the Google self-driving car. That cute little electric, mini, agile city vehicle.
I've seen an interesting trend, probably noticed in the Netherlands. I've studied there for a while. There are two types of cars made on the road. You have the super new cars, electric, whatever, Tesla, even the smaller one.
But the Tesla aesthetic, I think, is retrograde. Because it's this kind of sports car. I mean, we should hate these. Don't you think they're kind of so behind the curve? These kind of guys with Rolexes and sports car and Porsches and tanned faces. Who likes these guys? I mean, who's falling for these characters? Yeah, exactly.
Some of them are electric, some of them are actually very rough. They like to feel the engines. They have to quickly do some kind of.
Yeah, or people who like loud and noisy motorbikes. Harley Davidsons. I mean, please. You know that you're not going to have a conversation with them. It leads anywhere.
And I asked him. I asked the guy. I was meeting with the guy. And he was driving this kind of 70s Mercedes. I asked him, why do you like this one? Why don't you take the latest car? He told me because this is the car that I couldn't afford when I was. And everybody actually in the neighborhood was driving the cars that they couldn't afford 50 or 40 years ago.
I have this image, you know. Yeah. Anyway, so, look, the point is this: we have to grasp that aesthetic sensibilities and what we like, they need to be the intuitive grasp of the high performance, but the high performance could be on many dimensional, and cost included. Okay, I think we are running out of time. Exactly, rejection of pluralism means to tell this guy who loves 70s cars and Rolexes to have a deep rethink and brainwash. Because likelihood is that he's also a male chauvinist pig, that he is bossing around his people, that he is arrogant prick who is proud that he's earning more.
I agree, but how do you do that? How do you tell that guy that his choice in cars, which is based not on performance of the car, not on the safety of the car,
Yeah.
Isn't that, that's the interesting thing. He prefers driving that because of the experience. And I think that if you can give a similar experience, not the object itself, although the love is for the object, I think in the end it's not for the object.
Yeah.
The experience of that. So I think that...
He's very confused. The guy's very confused.
I think this is the main...
He's an anachronism. He's an anachronism, a societal anachronism. Look, there's still anachronistic arenas. There are places in the world where that tycoon, chauvinist pig can still succeed because it's in the provinces where they don't know better. Because this succeeded in some places are still like the 50s, so these characters can still survive somewhere. We need to adapt to the arenas. So this guy, how long this guy would survive at Google? You have to ask this. For me, Google is always a critical question. This friend, how long is he going to survive at Google? The Rolex will be left home the second day. Because everyone will make fun of him. Well, it's part of the value system, but as I said, because the guy also wants to talk down to, he calls women chicks. I just used that phrase. So he's dysfunctional on many levels. He can function in Google.
I think there are entrenched aesthetic views. With my sister, right? She's a Daily Mail reading Brexit vote. A school teacher in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. She hates my yellow.